The long grey afternoon settled over the ship without beginning or end, a seamless expanse of cloud and sea that stretched away on every side until the horizon disappeared into a soft blur of mist and spray. The deck beneath your feet carried a constant, deep vibration, a slow shudder that rose from the keel and travelled up through the heavy oak planks with each push of the great Southern Ocean swells. You stood in the waist of the ship, your shoulders tucked inside a worn woolen jacket that smelled faintly of salt and old tar, while the air around you held a damp chill that did not gust or bite, but simply remained, pressing against your cheeks with the patient weight of endless cold. The ship was an East Indiaman, a broad and sturdy vessel bound for England, with a cargo of tea and silk stowed deep in her hold. And she had been fighting the seas off Cape Horn for more days than anyone aboard cared to count. The motion of the vessel was not violent or sudden, but a long tilting lean to starboard that never quite recovered before the next swell took her again, so that you walked the deck as if climbing a gentle, invisible hill. Every timber and spar creaked in its own slow voice, a chorus of faint protests that formed the background music of all your waking hours. The rigging hummed a low note, the wind strumming the tarred ropes like a bow drawn across heavy strings, and this note never ceased, only rising or falling a half-tone as the gusts breathed through the maze of shrouds and stays. You had heard that note in your sleep for so many nights that it had become the sound of silence itself. The boatswain emerged from the forecastle hatch with the unhurried step of a man who had carried out this same routine in every ocean on the map, his brass call hanging against his chest and swinging with the ship's heel. He did not raise his voice or break into the rhythm of the day with any sudden shout. He simply walked to the foot of the mainmast, placed a hand on the pin-rail, and passed the word in a tone that was barely louder than the wind. "Topmen aloft to fist the topsail," he said, and the words drifted across the deck like a small ripple in a pond, touching each man in turn. The watch stirred without urgency, some rising from where they had been crouched in the lee of the boats, others turning from the rail where they had been gazing out at the unchanging sea. You turned your collar up against the moisture that hung in the air, tiny droplets that were not quite rain and not quite spray, but something in between, a cold mist that clung to wool and hair and made every surface slick with a dull sheen. Your hands, already chapped and raw from days of handling wet hemp, began to tingle with the anticipation of the frozen rope that waited aloft. You did not dread the climb or welcome it. The feeling sat somewhere far below those active emotions, in a quiet space of acceptance that had grown in you steadily since your first voyage as a boy. The work was simply what the day required, as natural as the tide and as neutral as the color of the sky. The deck stretched ahead of you as you began to move forward, your boots finding the planking with a series of soft, wet sounds, each footstep accompanied by a faint squelch of salt water that had seeped into the seams of the leather. The caulking between the planks showed dark and swollen, the oakum black with moisture, and in some places thin ribbons of frozen slush lay trapped in the cracks where the morning's wash had not quite drained away. You passed the main hatch, where the cargo lay battened under heavy tarpaulins that glistened with ice, and you saw the galley stack puffing a thin thread of smoke that was torn sideways by the wind before it could rise 10 feet. The smell of boiling peas and salt beef drifted past you for a moment, mixing with the clean, metallic scent of the cold air, and then it was gone, replaced by the vast, empty smell of the open ocean. At the foremast, shrouds a small group of men were already gathering, their shapes bulky with layers of knitted wool and canvas, their caps pulled low over their ears. They did not speak. A nod passed between one and another, a slight lift of the chin that served as greeting and acknowledgement and farewell all in one small gesture. You joined them at the foot of the weather rigging, your shoulder brushing against the hard, twisted strands of the shroud as you looked up into the maze of rope and spar that climbed into the grey above. The ratlines, those thin cross ropes that served as a ladder, were glazed with a crust of frozen spray that sparkled dully even in the muted light, each rung looking brittle and uninviting. Above them, the futtock shrouds leaned outward in their awkward flare, and above those again the top itself, a broad platform of planks that seemed impossibly high, though you knew from long practice exactly how many steps it took to reach it. The ship gave a heavy roll to leeward just as you laid your hand on the first shroud, and you leaned your weight into the motion without thinking, your body compensating for the tilt with the same automatic ease that keeps a man upright on a moving horse. The sea washed against the hull far below the waterline with a sound like a deep, muffled drumbeat, a slow thud that vibrated through the wood and into the palm of your hand. You stood for a moment feeling that pulse, letting it settle into the rhythm of your own pulse until they seemed to beat together. The wind pressed at your back, steady and insistent, not pushing you forward but simply reminding you of its presence, a constant force that shaped every movement you would make from this moment until you returned to the deck. The frozen canvas of the topsail loomed above you, visible even from here as a pale, rigid shape stretched across the yard, its surface unnaturally smooth where the ice had filled every fold and wrinkle of the cloth. It no longer looked like fabric. It might have been a sheet of thin marble or a slab of old ivory, fixed in place and catching the flat light in a way that deadened all texture. The braces that should have been taut with wind strain hung in stiff, immobile curves, locked into shapes that the gale had set and the frost had preserved. You knew, without having to count, that the sail had been carrying ice for at least 3 hours, building layer upon layer as the spray froze on contact and the moisture in the air condensed into a hard white rind. Your hand closed around the shrouds, and the rough hemp bit into your palm through the thin leather of your glove, a familiar sensation that you had known in every latitude from the warm trades to the bitter North Atlantic. The rope was wet but not dripping, its surface filmed with a gelatinous slush that your grip warmed into water almost immediately. You felt the cold moving through the leather, a slow travel of numbness that began at the fingertips and crept toward the knuckles, and you flexed your hand once, twice to keep the blood moving. The other topmen were doing the same, flexing and relaxing, adjusting their footing, each absorbed in his own small preparations without haste or ceremony. Overhead the sky continued in its unbroken pallor, a ceiling of clouds so uniform that you could not tell where the sun might be hiding, nor whether the hour belonged to morning or afternoon. The light had that peculiar quality of high southern latitudes, a pewter-colored glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once, casting no shadows and blurring the edges of every object until the mast and the yard and the rigging all seemed to melt into one another. You lifted your gaze to the very top of the foremast, where the truck was lost in a thin trail of cloud, and then you lowered it again to the sea. That endless heaving plain of iron-grey water, streaked with white caps that rolled and vanished in endless procession. An albatross hung far to leeward, riding the wind on wings that never seemed to move, its shape a perfect dark cross against the lighter grey of the horizon. The boatswain was at the mainmast now, repeating the same quiet order, and his voice reached you as a murmur, the actual words lost but the meaning perfectly clear. You checked a tie of your cap, pulled it a fraction lower over your brow, and felt the first small trickle of melted ice run from the brim down your temple. Your breath clouded in front of your face, white and dense, and the cloud lingered for a second before the wind tore it into nothing. You watched the next man in line step onto the rail and take hold of the ratlines, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as if he were climbing the stairs to an attic. And then it was your turn, the cold wood of the rail pressing against the shin of your boot as you swung yourself out over the water. But you did not climb yet. You stood there on the bulwark, one hand on the shroud, one foot braced against the gunwale, and you let your eyes travel once more along the whole length of the ship. Below you, the sea surged and fell away, a deep-breathing mass of water that stretched out into the south with nothing beyond it but more water and more cloud and the unbroken wind. The ship's wake curved away in a long, foaming line that disappeared into the grey distance, a trail of pale turbulence that was the only mark of your passage. You could feel the weight of the vessel under you, the heavy, laden mass of her that carried hundreds of tons of cargo and the lives of 100 men, all of it held up by the thin shell of oak and copper that rode the swell with a tired, patient strength. The moment of stillness lasted only a few heartbeats, perhaps the space of one wave rising and passing beneath the keel, and then you turned your face upward and began to settle your weight onto the first ratline. The cold metal of the daydies gleamed beside you, the lanyards drawn tight and frozen into rigid spirals, and you noted without concern that a thin film of ice had formed on the brass pins of the fife rail as well. Everything about the ship was slowly being encased, inch by inch, in a layer of crystalline frost that would need to be knocked away before the next watch or the next change of wind. But that was a task for another hour, another pair of hands, and your own task now was simply to climb, to rise through the shrouds with the slow mechanical patience of a pendulum swinging, until you reached the yard and the stiff canvas that waited. The wind increased a fraction as you took your first step upward, a long, steady push that pressed your coat against your back and made the rope tremble under your fingers. You heard the faint, high-pitched whistle of the breeze passing through the rigging screws and the subtle creak of the mast stepping in its partners far below. And then you began the ascent, the deck falling away beneath you by inches, the world reducing itself to the simple, repeated motions of hand over hand and foot over foot, until there was nothing left but the rope and the cold and the slow, even sound of your own breathing. The first ratline took your weight with a faint crunch that travelled up through your boot and into the bones of your foot, a sensation so slight it was almost a memory of sound rather than the sound itself. The frozen crust that had formed on the hemp cracked in a neat, circular pattern beneath the pressure of your sole, and a few tiny particles of ice fell away, spinning as they dropped past your shoulder and vanished into the air below. You did not look down to watch them fall. Your gaze remained fixed on the rope in front of your face, where a thin white bloom of frost coated the twisted strands and muted the familiar golden brown of the tarred fibre into a pale, dusty ochre. Your second foot found the rung beside the first, and then you were standing with your whole weight suspended between the shroud and the ratlines, the ship's motion translating instantly through the rigging and into the soles of your boots in a slow rocking sway. The shrouds themselves were a ladder of sorts, though nothing like the neat, squared ladders of the shore, for the ratlines were spaced widely enough that each step required a deliberate lift of the knee, and the ship's constant heel meant that as you climbed, you leaned ever outward, your body forming a diagonal line against the grey backdrop of the sea. You placed your right hand on the next rung higher, felt the brittle shell of ice break under your fingers and the soft, wet give of the hemp beneath, and then you pulled upward, shifting your weight from foot to foot in a motion that had become as natural to you over the years as the act of walking itself. The wind, which had been a steady pressure at your back while you stood on deck, now began to wrap around you from various angles as you rose above the shelter of the bulwarks, nudging your left shoulder, then your right hip, in an unpredictable pattern that kept the loose fabric of your jacket snapping in a low, irregular rhythm. Around you the complex web of standing rigging hummed and trembled, each part contributing its own note to the great quiet chord of the ship under strain. The forestay, a massive cable of twisted hemp that ran from the foremast down to the bowsprit, sang a deep, almost inaudible bass note that you felt more in your chest than heard with your ears. The backstays, thinner and running aft, gave off a higher, tighter vibration, a shivering whisper that seemed to travel right through the wood of the mast and into the palm of your hand each time you shifted your grip. All these sounds blended together into a single continuous texture of noise, and against this texture your own sounds, the crunch of your boots, the soft rasp of your gloves on the rope, stood out with the clarity of small pebbles dropped into still water. The climb continued in its unhurried way, each step a small world of its own, complete with its own small set of decisions, where to place the ball of the foot, how tightly to grip the shroud, when to pause and let the ship complete a particularly deep roll, so that the motion would not throw your rhythm off balance. You counted none of these pauses, for counting implied an impatience, a desire to reach an end, and there was no end to be desired here, only the next rung and the rung after that. Your breath laboured a little harder than it would have on a still day, the cold air drawing a thin, sharp line of awareness through your throat and into your lungs, where it bloomed into a warmth that spread through your chest before exiting again as a cloud of vapour that the wind tore sideways. The cold that had been nibbling at your fingers earlier now settled into a steady, dull ache in the knuckles of both hands, an ache that you acknowledged without annoyance, as you might acknowledge the presence of a chair in a room. Looking neither up nor down, but straight ahead at the complexity of rope immediately before you, you noted the minute details of the rigging's construction, details that only a topman would ever have reason to see. The serving, that tight wrapping of twine that protected the shroud where it passed through a block or chafed against a spar, had frayed in several places and become fuzzy with fibres that were now stiffened by frost into a sort of delicate lacework. A drop of tar, long hardened and frozen, gleamed like a dark gem embedded in the twist of the rope. A small feather, perhaps from some bird at the southern latitudes, had lodged itself between two strands and remained there, perfectly preserved by the cold, its barbs outlined in tiny crystals. You looked at these things, not with curiosity or wonder, but with the same passive, accepting gaze that you turned upon the sea itself, simply absorbing them as part of the slow, unfolding present. Time behaved strangely in the shrouds, as it always did when you climbed with no reference point beyond the gradual reduction of the deck below and the incremental growth of the yard above. The minutes did not march so much as pull, gathering in still, deep pockets around each pause, each adjustment of the hands, each long, slow blink that swept the moisture from your lashes and returned the world in a blur that sharpened again after a second. You might have climbed for a quarter of an hour or half of one. The difference mattered to no one and nothing, least of all to yourself, for the work was its own measure and its own reward. The rest of the watch, the ship, the entire voyage receded into a sort of mental fog that left only the immediate sensations, the feel of the rope, the sound of the wind, the slow, pendulous tilt of the mast. At some point during the ascent, the quality of the ice on the ratlines began to change, becoming thicker and more opaque. No longer a mere glaze, but a proper crust that required a firmer step to break through. This told you, without any conscious calculation, that you had climbed above the level where the spray from the bow was regularly washing the lower rigging, and that the moisture here was primarily from the mist and the cloud itself, freezing in place as it touched the already chilled hemp. The ice here had a different texture under your grip, more crystalline and less slushy, and it clung to your gloves after you released each rung, so that after a few more steps both palms were covered in a thin, white powder that looked like ground chalk. You brushed them against the thighs of your trousers out of habit, and the powder fell away in a brief, pale cascade, disappearing into the void beneath you. The ship's roll seemed more pronounced here, higher above the pivot point of her center of gravity, and each time she leaned to leeward, you felt your body swing out over a greater and greater arc of empty air. The sensation was not one of danger or exhilaration, but simply of geometry, the natural arc of a pendulum describing its path through space, and you compensated without thinking by leaning your shoulders into the mastward side of the shroud, letting the tension of the rope support a portion of your weight. The foot rope at the topsail yard, that slender loop of cord that would later support you as you worked, was now visible as a thin, dark line against the pale cloth of the sail, and you noted its presence as you might note a crack in a ceiling, with a sort of idle, non-committal recognition. Looking up for the first time in many minutes, you saw the futtock shrouds leaning outward above you, their curious backward-angled structure designed to carry the rigging out around the edge of the top itself. They formed a sort of bottleneck in the climb, a place where the straightforward ascent of the ratlines gave way to an awkward, backward-leaning scramble that every man aboard, no matter how experienced, approached with the same deliberate care. But you were not yet at the futtock shrouds, and there were still many rungs to climb before your hands would close around those outflung ropes. So you lowered your gaze once more and continued the slow, patient progress upward, your mind a blank, placid surface upon which the wind and the cold and the ceaseless motion of the ship made no lasting impression. The sounds of the deck, which had been a faint background murmur when you began the climb, had now faded almost entirely into the vast hollow sound of the wind. Occasionally a voice would lift up from below, thin and papery and stripped of all meaning, or the clank of a chain would echo up through the timber of the mast. But these noises seemed to belong to another world, one that you would return to eventually, but for now had no part in. Your world had shrunk to the square yard of rigging immediately around your body, and everything outside that small frame was simply weather, simply distance, simply the grey moving backdrop of the Southern Ocean and its endless, patient sky. The effort of the climb was not great, for you had done this 1,000 times, but the cold made every motion feel slightly removed, as if your limbs were operating a quarter second behind the commands your mind issued. You would think of lifting your hand and the hand would lift, but the arrival of the hand at the next rung felt somehow delayed, wrapped in a layer of insulation that was part physical, the thick wool of your gloves and the thicker numbness of your skin, and part mental, the slowing effect of the wind and the monotonous rhythm of the climb. This feeling was not unpleasant, merely strange in the way that all common things become strange when you look at them too long, until climbing a ship's rigging in freezing weather seemed no more unusual than sitting in a chair by a fire. The spray that had been a heavy, soaking mist at deck level now reached you only in the form of occasional droplets that were picked up by the gusting wind and thrown high, and these droplets were cold enough that they froze on contact with your cheek, forming tiny, hard pearls of ice that clung to the stubble of your beard and made a faint, musical click when you turned your head. You did not wipe them away. The body's heat would melt them in time, and the moisture would run down your skin in a slow, cold trickle that you had long ago stopped noticing. The ship gave another deep roll to leeward, and you saw the sea, far below now, tilt and heave in its own endless rhythm, a movement so vast and ancient that it made the motion of the ship seem like a child copying an adult's walk. Your hands, moving in their steady, automatic pattern, found the next rung, and the next, and the next, while your feet followed in their turn, the 4 points of contact never breaking at the same time, so that you were always securely attached to the rigging by at least one hand and one foot. This was a rule that had been drilled into you on your very first day aloft, a rule so fundamental that it had long ago passed from conscious thought into the realm of bone-deep instinct. And you followed it now without the slightest mental effort, as effortlessly as your heart continued to beat. The hemp under your hands was rougher now, the tarred surface having been worn away by years of handling until the fibers themselves lay exposed, and these fibers, coarse and slightly hairy, provided a grip that was surprisingly secure even through the thin, wet leather of your gloves. The color of the sky had altered almost imperceptibly during the climb, shifting from the flat, even pewter of the early afternoon to a slightly deeper, heavier grey that hinted at the approach of evening, though the sun itself remained hidden behind the unbroken ceiling of cloud. The light therefore did not so much fade as thicken, the air itself seeming to grow more substantial, more resistant to vision, until the details of the upper rigging that had been sharp and clear at the start of the climb were now slightly blurred, their edges softened by the thickening atmosphere. But this change was so gradual that you noticed it only by accident, when you glanced at the fore-topmast shroud and found that its familiar outline was no longer quite so crisp against the sky, and even then the observation passed through your mind without leaving a ripple. A long way off, on the very edge of the visible world, a patch of slightly lighter grey appeared for a moment, a ghost of a patch that might have been a hole in the cloud layer or merely a trick of the tired eye, and then it was gone, swallowed back into the uniform pallor of the sky. You had not been looking at it, but your peripheral vision had registered its brief existence, and the knowledge that it had been there and was now gone settled into you as a soft, wordless fact, adding itself to the great accumulation of facts that made up the day. The albatross that you had seen from the deck was still there too, its cruciform shape still riding the wind far to leeward, its wings still locked in their motionless spread, and you realized that it had been there for the entire duration of your climb, a constant presence that asked for nothing and gave nothing, simply existing in the same cold grey space as yourself. The fut-top shrouds were closer now, their outward-leaning lines clearly visible as they flared from the mast and passed through the lubber's hole in the top. And with their proximity came a subtle shift in the texture of the air, a faint increase in the wind's force as it funneled between the mast and the top. You could feel the extra pressure against your chest, a cool, firm hand that pushed you back a fraction, and you leaned into it slightly, adjusting the balance of your body with the same unthinking precision that you used to adjust your footing. There were perhaps a dozen rungs remaining before you would have to negotiate that awkward transition, and you did not hurry toward them, nor did you slow down. You simply continued the climb at the same measured pace you had maintained since leaving the deck. The icy rime on the shrouds here was thick enough that your handprints remained visible on the rope after you released your grip. 5 distinct depressions in the frost, each one a slowly closing shadow that would disappear in a few seconds as the cold air settled back into the vacant space. You noticed this without interest, noticing it in the same way you noticed the pattern of your own breathing, the slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction of your ribs that had become so automatic as to be almost foreign. The rope creaked softly under your hands, the sound a low animal groan that spoke of immense tensions held in careful balance, and you could feel the vibration of the mast through the shroud, a deep, constant thrumming that was the heartbeat of the ship itself. Below you the deck had become an abstract pattern of dark lines and pale rectangles, the men moving upon it reduced to the size of grains of rice, their movements so slow and intermittent that they might have been caught in some thick, invisible fluid. You did not look at them for more than a moment, for the climb demanded your eyes on the rigging before you. But that brief glance had been enough to remind you that the world below was still going about its business, still coiling ropes and checking lashings and doing all the small necessary tasks that kept the ship alive in this remote, indifferent ocean. The thought was neither comforting nor disconcerting. It was simply there, and then it was gone, replaced by the more immediate business of climbing another rung. As you neared the top, the sense of exposure grew, no longer sheltering below the spreading width of the top itself, and the wind now had a clear sweep across your entire body, from the crown of your cap to the soles of your boots. The air was noticeably colder, each inhalation sharp enough to sting the lining of your nose, each exhalation pluming into a dense cloud that the wind shredded into nothing before it could take shape. Your eyelashes had begun to accumulate a fine white border of frost, and when you blinked, you could feel the tiny crystals catching against one another, a sensation that was part tickle and part sting. You did not rub your eyes, knowing from experience that rubbing would only spread the moisture and make the frost form again, thicker and more annoying than before. And still the climb continued, step by step, handhold by handhold, the futtock shrouds growing larger and more distinct with each passing minute, until at last you reached the point where the ratlines ended and the broad platform of the top spread out above your head, its dark planks wet with melted ice and gleaming faintly in the dim light. Here you paused, not because the climb had tired you, but because the transition from the straight ratlines to the outward-leaning futtock shrouds required a different set of motions, a different arrangement of the body, and it was wise to gather yourself a moment before making that change. You held the shroud tightly, felt the cold wood of the mast pressing against your shoulder, and simply waited, breathing steadily, listening to the hum of the wind, settling into the stillness that was the natural end of any long, slow ascent into the rigging of an East Indiaman sailing the grey waters off Cape Horn. The futtock shrouds leaned away from the mast in their familiar outward slant, a series of iron rods and rope lengths that pushed a climber backward into empty air before he could haul himself up through the lubber's hole and onto the top. You had made this transition more times than you could recall, yet you never took it as a matter of pure routine, because the geometry of the body demanded a brief reordering of the limbs, a small negotiation between habit and circumstance. The wind, funneling between the mast and the wooden platform above, hummed with a higher, thinner note here, and you paused for a long moment with your hands still on the last of the ratlines, your feet securely planted, simply letting the ship complete a deep, groaning roll to starboard before you committed your weight to the next set of holds. The futtock shrouds were not rope but iron, forged into long, smooth bars that curved outward from the masthead to the edge of the top, and they were coated in the same crust of grey-white ice that covered everything aloft. The metal had a different quality of cold from the hemp, a deeper, more penetrating chill that seemed to reach through your gloves with a single touch, and you braced yourself for that sensation before you let go of the shroud and reached out to take hold of the nearest rod. Your fingers closed around it, and the cold shot up through your wrist and into your forearm as if you had grasped a shard of frozen stone. But you held on, tightening your grip until the ice cracked and flaked away under the pressure of your palm. Your second hand followed, and then you were hanging back from the mast at a shallow angle, your heels still on the ratlines, and your body describing a diagonal line that pointed out and up toward the rim of the top. The shift of posture required you to lean backward, your spine curving against the empty space, your head tilting up to see the edge of the platform above. The sky, uniform and colorless, filled your vision for a moment, a blank, pale canvas that offered no purchase for the eye, and then your gaze found the dark wood of the top's edge, the grain of the planks visible even through the thin film of ice. You lifted your right foot from the ratlines and placed it on the first of the iron rungs that served as steps through the futtock shrouds, feeling the peculiar, unyielding hardness of the metal through your wet boot. Then your left foot joined it, and you began the short, backward-leaning climb that would bring you to the lubber's hole, that square opening in the platform through which every man passed from the lower rigging into the upper world of the masts. The iron rungs were slippery despite the crust of ice, and you moved with a careful, unhurried precision, transferring one hand and then one foot, never breaking more than one point of contact, exactly as you had been taught in your earliest days at sea. The ship's rolling motion felt more pronounced here, perhaps because you were leaning out and back, and each heave of the hull sent a corresponding sway through your body that pulled you away from the mast and then let you settle back toward it in a slow, pendulous rhythm. You did not fight this motion, but moved with it, allowing the ship to dictate the pace of your small advances so that you climbed not in a steady stream, but in a series of incremental nudges, each one perfectly timed to the long breathing swell of the Southern Ocean. Your breath came in visible clouds that rose past your face and vanished upward through the lubber's hole, as if your own exhalations were climbing ahead of you to announce your arrival. The lubber's hole itself was a square aperture cut into the planking of the top, roughly the width of a man's shoulders if he turned slightly, and its edges were worn smooth by decades of wool-clad bodies squeezing through. The ice had formed a sort of collar around its rim, a thick, white ring of frozen spray that sparkled dully in the muted light, and as you drew closer, you could see the individual crystals catching the pale glow and throwing it back in 1,000 tiny points of brightness. You reached up and gripped the edge of the planks, feeling the ice crunch under your fingers, and then you pulled, a slow, sustained heave that brought your shoulders level with the opening, and then through it, your body straightening as you emerged onto the broad, flat surface of the foretop. The top was a platform of heavy oak planks, roughly 15 feet across, bounded on all sides by a low rail and pierced at its center by the butt of the topmast, which rose from the deck far below and continued upward into the sky. The planks beneath your boots were wet with melted ice and stained a deep, almost black brown from years of tar and salt, and they had a roughness underfoot that came from the caulking between them, which had swollen and receded so many times that it now formed shallow ridges between each board. You stood upright for the first time since leaving the deck, and the relief of unbending your spine and squaring your shoulders was a quiet, deep pleasure that spread through your back and into your neck. The wind, which had been a steady pressure during the climb, now hit you squarely across the chest, and you turned slightly to present your shoulder to it, a small adjustment that made the difference between standing comfortably and being pushed a step backward. From the top you could see the whole complex architecture of the upper rigging spread out around you like a map, the shrouds and stays and braces radiating away from the mast in every direction, each one taut with the strain of wind and canvas. The mainmast rose aft of you, its own top a dark shelf against the grey sky, and beyond it the mizzen, smaller and slimmer, carrying its own burden of frozen sails. The ship seemed both larger and smaller from up here, larger in the sense that you could now see the full reach of her rigging, the immense web of rope that kept the mast standing and the yards braced, and smaller in the sense that the hull itself had become a narrow, dark sliver of wood far beneath you, riding the swells like a chip of bark. You took all this in with a slow, sweeping gaze that asked nothing and registered everything, a gaze that had become habitual over years of standing in this very spot. The foretopsail yard stretched across the top at chest height, a massive spar of Baltic fir that was thicker than your thigh at its center and tapered toward the ends where the foot loops hung in long, dark curves. The yard was supported by a complicated arrangement of lifts and braces, all of which were glazed with ice and rigid as iron, and it rotated slightly on its truss with each heave of the ship, a motion so subtle that only a close observer would notice it. The topsail itself hung beneath the yard, a great pale wall of frozen canvas that blocked your view of the deck below, its surface irregular with the lumps and ridges of ice that had formed over many hours. It was this that you had come to fist, this rigid, unyielding curtain that had to be reduced and furled before the wind could tear it to pieces, or before the weight of the ice could carry the yard down. The scale of the task was not large in the grand scheme of things, but it was what the day had presented, and you accepted it with the same calm neutrality with which you accepted the cold and the wind and the long grey light. The foot rope was the next step, the slender hemp line that hung beneath the yard and provided the only standing place for a man working on the sail. It sagged in a deep sweeping curve from the yard arm to the slings at the center, a catenary of rope that looked thin and fragile against the mass of the spar, but which you knew from experience could hold the weight of several men without complaint. The foot rope was wet, of course, and its surface was not so much coated with ice as saturated with it. the fibers of the hemp having absorbed the freezing spray until the rope itself had become a sort of solid, frozen cylinder. You would need to walk out along that frozen line, your inner arm hooked over the yard, your body suspended above a void that grew deeper with every step toward the yard arm, and you would need to do it with the same patient, steady care that you had brought to the climb. You moved to the forward edge of the top, where the foot rope began its curve from the yard arm, and you stood for a moment with both hands on the cold, wet wood of the sail, feeling the ice crack under your palms. The transition from the solid planks of the top to the swinging foot rope was always the moment that gave a man pause, not out of fear, for there was nothing to fear in a thing so familiar, but out of a sort of respect for the geometry of the act. You had to step off a firm surface and onto a line that would sag and sway under your weight, and you had to do it while swinging your body under the yard and hooking your arm over the spar, all in one smooth, continuous motion that could not be rushed or halted midway. You gathered yourself, not taking a deep breath or tensing your muscles, but simply stilling the small, unnecessary movements of your body until you were as calm and steady as the mast itself. Then you moved. Your right hand reached out and grasped the yard, the wood rough and icy under your glove, and your right foot followed, stepping off the planks and onto the foot rope, which sank under your weight with a low, creaking groan, and then held. You swung your left leg across and up, hooking your inner arm over the yard and pulling your body close to the spar, so that your armpit rested against the wood and your chest pressed into the frozen sail. The foot rope sagged further, settling you into a position that was half sitting, half standing, with your hips lower than your shoulders and your feet braced wide apart on the rope. The world rearranged itself around you, the sea sliding into view beneath your dangling legs, the deck disappearing behind the bulging curve of the sail, and you let out a breath that you had not been aware of holding. The cold of the yard seeps through your jacket and into the soft flesh of your inner arm, a deep, slow chill that spread outward from the point of contact like a stain, but you did not shift away from it, for the yard was your anchor and your balance point, the thing that kept you from tumbling backward into the void. The foot rope swayed with the ship's roll, a long, lazy swing that carried you out over the sea and then back over the deck, and you rode that motion without tension, letting your body absorb the rhythm as a rider absorbs the gait of a horse. The sound of the wind was different here, lower and more hollow, a steady roar that seemed to come from beneath your feet as much as from above, and it joined with the deep creaking of the yard and the faint rhythmic slap of waves against the distant hull to form a single, seamless blanket of noise. Beside you, the other topmen were finding their places along the yard, their shapes dark and bulky against the pale canvas, their movements as slow and deliberate as your own. No words passed between you. The wind would have torn them away before they could be heard, and besides, there was nothing that needed to be said. Each man knew his station on the yard, his particular section of sail to fist, his particular gaskets to tie, and the work would proceed in a wordless, cooperative rhythm that had been refined over many voyages and many storms. You acknowledged their presence with the same wordless awareness that you might acknowledge the presence of trees in a forest, simply noting that they were there and then returning your attention to the task immediately before you. The sail itself, now that you were pressed against it, revealed its texture in intimate detail. The canvas, which from the deck had seemed uniformly pale and smooth, was in fact a complex landscape of folds and ridges, each one sculpted by the wind before the frost had set. The ice had formed in uneven layers, thicker in the hollows where spray had pooled, and thinner on the raised ridges where the wind had scoured it away, and the overall effect was of a frozen waterfall, a cascade of pale forms caught in mid-motion. The fabric beneath the ice was hard and unyielding, its threads locked together by the frozen moisture that had soaked into the weave, and when you pressed your palm against it, you felt not the soft give of cloth, but the solid, resistant surface of something more akin to bark or leather. The cold radiating from the canvas was intense enough that you could feel it through your glove and through the already numbed skin of your fingers, a steady, patient cold that asked nothing but gave nothing either. Your position on the yard placed you perhaps a third of the way out from the center, a spot that gave you a clear view of the bowsprit and the jibboom stretching forward into the grey haze, their own sails also glazed and rigid. The sea ahead of the ship was an unbroken expanse of heaving grey, its surface textured with the countless small ridges of wind-driven waves that rolled toward the bow in endless, identical procession. The horizon, where it could be seen at all, was a faint, ghostly line that wavered and dissolved into the haze, so that the boundary between sea and sky was not a line, but a gradual transition, a zone of uncertainty where the grey of the water paled into the grey of the air without any definite border. The whole world seemed to be made of the same muted, dusty color, as if you were looking at a sketch rendered in charcoal and chalk. The chill had now settled deeply into your hands, your feet, and your face, but it was a stable cold, a cold that had reached an equilibrium with your body's heat and would not grow worse unless the wind increased or the temperature dropped further. You flexed your fingers inside your gloves, working the stiffness out of the knuckles, and felt the leather crackle with the thin film of ice that had formed on its surface. The motion of your fingers was slow and clumsy, the muscles responding with a slight delay, but you could still grit and hold, and that was all the work required. You ran your hand over the frozen canvas before you, mapping the ridges and hollows, feeling for the best place to take your first hold, and the ice whispered against your glove, with a sound like fine sand being poured slowly onto paper. The ship gave a particularly deep roll to leeward, and the footrope swung you out over the sea in a long sweeping arc that brought the grey water closer, so close that you could see the white foam of a breaking wave far below, a small fleeting pattern of lace against the dark surface. Then the roll reversed, carrying you back over the deck, and the whole swung into view beneath the bulge of the sail. Its familiar shape, dark and solid, the men on its planks still moving in their small, unhurried ways. You watched this without any particular feeling, noting the pendulum swing of the ship and your own body's place within it, and then the motion steadied, settling back into the slow, regular rhythm that was the baseline of all experience aboard this vessel. The light had continued to thicken and dim during your time on the yard, the afternoon slowly surrendering itself to the approach of evening, and the temperature had fallen another fraction, enough that the moisture in your breath now froze instantly on the air, forming a fine, sparkling mist that drifted away to leeward. The yard itself was beginning to accumulate a new layer of frost, the warmth of your body having melted a thin film of the existing ice, which then refroze as you shifted your position, adding a fresh, glassy skin over the older, whiter crust. This cycle of melting and refreezing was as old as the sea itself, and you paid it no more attention than you paid to the beating of your heart or the slow blink of your eyes. You were ready now, balanced on the foot rope with your arm hooked over the yard and your free hand resting on the frozen sail, ready to begin the long, repetitive work of fisting the canvas from its stiff, iced condition into a compact, manageable bundle. The other topmen were similarly positioned along the yard, their hands also resting on the sail, their bodies also swaying in the same slow rhythm. The wind hummed its endless note, the rigging creaked its ancient complaint, the sea breezed in and out against the hull with the patience of a sleeping creature. And there, in that high, cold, lonely place, suspended between the grey water and the grey sky, you began to close your fingers around the first fold of frozen canvas, your mind a still, calm pool reflecting only the small, simple motions that would fill the next hour of your life. The yard under your chest was a solid, dependable beam of spruce timber that had crossed the Southern Ocean more times than any living man aboard could remember, and its surface, worn smooth by decades of chafing canvas and gripping hands, now bore a skin of frost that sparkled dully in the grey light with the texture of crushed glass. You lay along it with your inner arm hooked over the spar as naturally as you might hook your arm over the back of a settle, your body angled outward over the long drop to the sea by the gentle outward thrust of the foot beneath your boots. The foot rope itself sagged in a comfortable shallow curve between its stirrups, and when it lifted slightly with the next roll of the ship you lifted with it, your knees absorbing the motion without thought. From this perch the whole expanse of the frozen topsail spread out below and ahead of you, a landscape in miniature, a country of stiffened fabric and crystallized salt that you would now need to read before you could begin to work. The topsail of an East Indiaman was a vast acreage of flax canvas, even in its natural state, broad enough to blanket a small field, and this particular sail had been carrying the ship through the heavy airs of the Horn for 6 unbroken days of grey sky and steady wind. In all that time, the spray had been flying and the mist had been settling, and now the entire cloth stood before you, transformed by degrees into something that appeared to belong more to the mineral world than to the vegetable. The color was the first thing you noticed, not because it was striking, but because it was so entirely absent, bleached out by the rime into an almost uniform pale grey that matched the sky so closely that in places the border between canvas and cloud became an act of faith rather than sight. Where the sail had once been a warm, tawny brown, it now showed only the faintest, most muted hint of that original tone, barely visible in the deeper folds where the frost had not quite managed to penetrate. The texture of the frozen sail was a thing that demanded its own slow, patient catalogue. Nearest the yard, the cloth had gathered into a series of shallow, horizontal ridges, each one the ghost of a fold that had been pressed into the fabric by the weight of the wind before the cold had set it in place. And these ridges were hard and unyielding to the eye, their edges crisp as though cut with a blunt knife from a block of soft chalk. Further out toward the belly of the sail, the ridges gave way to larger undulations, broad swells and hollows that mirrored the invisible pressures of the gale that had shaped them. And these undulations caught the flat light in a way that made them seem almost polished, slick with a veneer of frozen salt that glinted faintly under your steady gaze. The bulge ropes, those thick, cable-like borders that defined the sail's outer edges, were encased in a sheath of ice so thick that the individual twists of the rope beneath were entirely lost, and what remained was a smooth, rounded form that reminded you of the frozen gutters of a farmhouse in deep winter. You ran your eyes slowly along the leach of the sail, that sloping edge that ran from the yardarm down to the deck, and noted how the ice had built up unevenly, thicker in some stretches and thinner in others, according to the caprice of the wind and the spray. Where the leech had been fluttering most actively before the freeze, it now presented a ragged, fringe-like border of tiny icicles that hung straight down and did not sway even in the strongest gusts, their weight and rigidity proof against any force the sky could bring. The foot of the sail, far below, was lost in a deeper gloom where the shadow of the hull fell across the lower canvas, but even there you could make out the pale gleam of ice, continuous and unbroken, sealing the entire mass into one stiff, cooperative panel. The clews, those reinforced corners where the sheets pulled down, were invisible from your angle, buried somewhere in the frozen murk beneath the yard, and you did not trouble yourself to look for them, knowing they would be there when you needed them, solid and secure, and equally encased. The sound of the frozen sail was a quiet thing, but it was not silence. When the ship rolled and the pressure on the mast altered by a fraction of a degree, the ice-laden cloth emitted a low, groaning crackle that was not the sudden snap of breaking timber, but a prolonged, gradual sound, like the stretching of old leather that had been left out in a frost. This crackle was interspersed with smaller, sharper pops that came from deep within the folds as tiny pockets of trapped air or pockets of softer ice adjusted to the shifting load, and the whole effect was of a living, breathing surface that had been stilled not into death, but into a state of suspended, crystalline patience. You listened to these sounds not in order to learn anything from them, but simply because they were there, part of the fabric of the moment, as natural as the cry of the distant birds and the deep, rhythmic thud of the sea against the hull far below. The rime itself varied in thickness across the sail in a pattern that you could read as easily as a farmer reads his fields after a snowfall. Where the spray had been driven most heavily against the weather side, the ice was thickest, building up in a crust that measured perhaps the width of your thumb from the surface of the canvas outward, a dense white accumulation that had the frosted, bubbly look of old snow packed hard by the wind. Where the sail had been partially sheltered by the yard or by its own billowing folds, the ice was thinner, a mere glaze that coated each individual fibre of the flax without filling in the gaps between them, so that the weave of the cloth was still faintly visible beneath the frozen layer, like a fossil impressed in a slab of pale stone. And in a few rare places, deep in the most protected creases, the canvas was still soft, still pliable, still bearing its original tawny colour, with only a dusting of fine crystals that glittered like a scattering of pale sand. The light, which had been thick and uniform all afternoon, now began to develop a subtle, low-angle quality that told you without any conscious timekeeping that the sun, invisible behind the clouds, was sinking somewhere far to the west and beginning its slow slide toward the horizon. This change in the light did not make the sail any easier to see. If anything, the increasing dimness softened the contrast between the ice and the cloth, and made the entire mass appear even more monolithic, even more like a single, undivided slab of frozen material. But the change did cast into slightly sharper relief the precise spots where the rime was thickest, because those spots caught the last of the day's diffuse glow and held it a moment before releasing it, creating a faint, pearl-like luminosity that guided your eye from one point to the next along the length of the yard. You followed that guided tour without haste, noting each pale patch, each subtle thickening, and assembling in the back of your mind a quiet, unspoken map of where your first efforts would need to fall. The size of the task before you was considerable, but you did not measure it in words like large or difficult. You measured it in the length of the yard and the number of hands that were ranged along it. The topsail yard stretched a good 60 feet from tip to tip, a span of timber that required 6 topmen to cover it adequately, and each man was responsible for the canvas that fell within his own arm's reach, a segment roughly 10 feet wide and more than twice that deep if you counted the cloth all the way down to the reef points. Your own segment lay directly before you, marked on the left by the slight, barely perceptible bulge of the first reef band, and on the right by the darker, tarred line of the gasket that had been left loose when the sail was set days ago and which now hung frozen into a rigid, twisted spiral. These boundaries were as clear to you as the walls of your childhood room, and you settled into them as you would settle into any familiar space, your awareness narrowing to the particular patch of frozen cloth that was yours to tend. The procedure for breaking the ice from the canvas and gathering it in was one that you had learned so long ago and practiced so many times that it existed in your muscles far more than in your mind, a deep physical knowledge that did not require words or even thoughts to execute. But before the body could act, the eye had to survey, and the eye's survey had its own slow, methodical rhythm that could not be rushed any more than a tide could be hurried. You looked first at the uppermost edge of your section, the part of the sail that lay directly along the yard beneath the jackstay, where the canvas was seized to the spar by a series of small, doubled ropes that were now completely buried in ice, so that only their faint, darker cores were visible through the frost-like dead stems under winter pond ice. This would be the hardest place to break free, because the ice here had been compacted by the weight of the sail pulling against the yard for days on end, and the cold of the timber itself had radiated down into the cloth, deepening the freeze. You looked next at the middle of your section, the broad belly of the sail that bellied outward when full of wind, but now hung in its frozen folds more or less vertically, for perhaps 15 feet before it was gathered into the buntline tackle and pulled upward into a series of deep, puckered gathers. This middle part was where the wind had pressed most consistently, and the ice here had a different character, harder and more glassy, as though each gust had driven a fresh layer of moisture into the fibers where it had frozen instantly in sheets rather than in the softer, frothier accumulations of the edges. The folds here were deeper, and the frost had penetrated into the very heart of each crease, so that when you moved your gaze across the surface, you could see a faint, regular pattern of white lines tracing the path of every wrinkle, like a cartographer's drawing of contour lines on a map of a gentle hill. You looked at the lower part of your section, which was the most difficult to see clearly because it extended downward almost to the top of the lower mast, and was partially obscured by the bunt lines themselves and by the bulk of the frozen sail above. But you could still make out the heavy, drooping curve of the cloth where it was gathered and held by the clew lines, and you could see that the ice here was thickest of all, built up in a great bulbous mass that looked almost soft, almost like a drift of snow, though you knew from experience that it would be as hard as old bone, and just as reluctant to yield. This was the part of the sail that had been most often in the water, or near it, as the ship rolled her lee rail under, and the constant soaking and freezing had produced a layer of rime that was as dense and solid as the sea ice that formed in the quiet bays of far southern islands. The survey took several minutes, though you did not count them, and when it was complete you found that your hands had been resting motionless on the chilled wood of the yard for the whole duration, your gloves already stiffening with the cold that radiated up from the spar. You flexed your fingers, feeling the leather crackle, and the small movement sent a flurry of fine ice crystals pattering down onto the sail below, where they joined the general accumulation without altering its appearance in the slightest. The man to your left had completed his own survey and was now simply resting, his chin tucked into the collar of his jacket, his eyes half closed against the steady push of the wind, and the man to your right was in the process of shifting his footing on the footrope, a slow, careful shuffle that produced a rhythmic creaking from the hem. The other 3 topmen on the yacht were similarly still, similarly patient, each one waiting in his own silence for the unvoiced signal that the work would begin. That signal was not a word or a gesture, but simply the moment when the quiet collective sense of readiness settled over the yard like a flock of birds coming to rest. A moment that you recognized without being able to name it. One moment the men on the yard were resting, their minds wandering in the grey, frozen space of the afternoon, and the next moment they were ready, each one oriented toward his section of sail, each pair of hands already beginning the first, almost imperceptible movement downward toward the frozen canvas. You felt the shift in yourself as a slight tightening of your attention, a focusing that did not excite or alarm, but merely concentrated the diffuse awareness of the preceding minutes into a single, calm point of intention. And then, because the moment had arrived, you reached down and took hold of the canvas, your fingers closing around a fold that felt exactly as you had known it would feel, cold and hard and resistant, waiting to be softened by the steady, patient warmth of your work. The first grip of the frozen canvas was not a grip at all, but a slow, careful placement of your fingers around a fold that did not yield to your touch in any way you would normally associate with cloth. The surface under your glove was hard and granular, more like a piece of rough-cut pumice stone than a woven textile, and when you tightened your hold the ice gave off a faint, high-pitched creak that travelled up through your hand and into the bones of your wrist. You did not squeeze with any force at first, understanding as all experienced topmen understood that the initial contact was a negotiation rather than a command, a gentle introduction of warmth and pressure to a material that had forgotten what warmth and pressure felt like. The skin of ice that covered the sail had a slight roughness to it, a texture of tiny, jagged peaks and valleys where the freezing spray had built up in irregular layers over successive watches, and as your hand settled into position these peaks began to soften, to crumble at their very tips, the heat of your palm working its way into the frozen structure particle by patient particle. Around you the other men were making the same first moves, their arms extending downward from the yard in a slow, synchronized motion that had the collective look of a row of oars dipping into still water, though the rhythm was not perfectly matched, and each man worked at his own internal pace. You could hear the soft, scattered sounds of their efforts, the crackle and whisper of ice breaking, the low grunt of a breath pushed out against the resistance of stiff cloth, the faint thump of a knee shifting against the yard, and these sounds wove together into a quiet, irregular pattern that sat just above the deeper, steadier noise of the wind and sea. The man to your left had already freed a small corner of his section and was working it back and forth between his hands, the canvas making a low, rasping sound like rough paper being folded, while the man to your right was still at the same stage as yourself, his hand simply resting on the ice, letting the heat do its first, invisible work. You began to move your fingers, not pulling or jerking but simply flexing them against the frozen surface, pressing down with the pads of your fingertips, and then releasing over and over in a slow, steady cycle that gradually transferred the warmth of your blood into the cold, crystalline lattice of the rime. The ice directly beneath your fingertips began to soften, to lose its white, opaque appearance and take on a translucent, wet sheen, and as it softened it transmitted the heat deeper into the fibers of the canvas below, where other tiny pockets of ice had formed in the very gaps between the woven strands. A single drop of water formed on the tip of your glove, the first meltwater of the day, and it hung there for a moment before sinking into the leather and leaving a darker, wet patch that would itself begin to freeze again if you stopped moving for too long. The knowledge of this cycle, of melting and refreezing, of the constant, patient contest between the warmth of your body and the cold of the Southern Ocean, sat in the back of your mind as a familiar, accepted reality that neither troubled nor encouraged you. After perhaps 2 minutes of this slow preparatory flexing, you felt the first small change in the fabric beneath your hand, a subtle softening that was less a movement than a hint of movement, a suggestion that the cloth was beginning to remember its own nature. The ice in the immediate area of your grip had now melted enough that the canvas could be compressed slightly, and when you pressed down, you could feel the individual threads shifting against one another with a faint, gritty sensation as the last crystals of ice rubbed together inside the weave. This was the moment you had been waiting for without impatience, the moment when the sail began to transition from a frozen slab back into a textile that could be folded and gathered, and you responded by deepening your grip, curling your fingers further around the fold and beginning to apply the first real, sustained pull. The canvas moved. It moved perhaps half an inch. The distance a slow breath travels in the body, and it moved with a sound like the crackling of old parchment being unfolded, a dry, many-layered rustle that spoke of thousands of tiny ice bonds snapping apart at once. The half-inch became an inch, and the inch became 2, and then the fold you had been holding came free entirely, a flap of canvas that had been locked into a rigid, upright ridge, now collapsing into your hand with a soft, crumbling sigh as the ice along its base gave way. The underside of the fold, the part that had been pressed against the body of the sail and sheltered from the direct spray, was still pale brown and still recognizably cloth, though it was cold and damp and slightly stiff with embedded salt, and you laid it over your forearm with the same gentle care you might use to lay a blanket over a sleeping child. That first fold secured, you shifted your attention to the next section of the ridge, placing your hand on a fresh patch of frost and beginning the cycle again. The work settled into a rhythm that was not fast and not slow, but simply steady, a rhythm that matched the rise and fall of the ship and the pulse of the wind and your own calm, even breathing. You would place your hand on the frozen canvas and let the warmth soften the ice. You would take hold of a fold and pull it slowly toward you until the ice along its base cracked and released. You would lay the freed cloth across the yard and move your hand 6 inches to the left or right and begin the same sequence again. The intervals between each small success were not measured or counted, and the work filled the time as naturally as water fills a pool, spreading into the available space without haste or urgency. Your shoulders and arms moved through their limited range of motion in a cycle that was as repetitious as the turning of a wheel, but never grew wearying because each small pull required only a modest effort, and because the cold numbed the muscles just enough to erase the sensation of fatigue. The ice that broke away from the canvas fell in a variety of ways depending on its thickness and character. The thinner surface crust would crumble into a fine white powder that sifted down the front of the sail and was whipped away by the wind before it could reach the deck, while the thicker, denser rime from the deeper folds would break off in small, flat plates that tumbled away end over end, catching the grey light as they fell. Some of these plates were large enough that you could hear them striking the lower canvas or the deck with a distant, muffled tap that reached your ears a full second after you saw them land, and some were small enough that they simply vanished into the gloom without any sound at all. You watched them fall without following their path, your eyes already fixed on the next patch of ice, your hands already reaching for the next fold. The canvas that emerged from beneath the ice was damp and heavy, saturated with meltwater and with the salt that had been dissolved in the spray before the freeze. When you gathered a fold of this damp cloth against the yard, you could feel the moisture seeping through your gloves and reaching your skin, a cold, wet seepage that added to the numbness already settled in your fingers. The salt in the cloth made it slightly rough, slightly abrasive, and after a dozen folds your gloves had begun to develop a whitish crystalline bloom around the palms and the inner fingers, as though they had been dipped in brine and left to dry in the sun. You noticed this without concern, knowing that gloves could be dried and softened later, that the salt would dissolve in fresh water back aboard the ship, that everything transient would pass in its own time. The wind, which had been a steady, directional force all day, now began to shift in small, unpredictable gusts that came from slightly different angles, as the afternoon wore on and the air pressure over the horizon altered by some invisible, incremental degree. These gusts would catch the edges of the freed canvas that you had laid over the yard and lift them slightly, flapping them against the spar with a soft, wet slap that reminded you to keep the cloth well tucked under your arm until it could be properly bunched and tied. The ice in those freed edges had melted just enough that the fabric could move, but not so much that it could dry, and the cold of the wind on the damp cloth would eventually begin to form a fresh, thin skin of frost if you left a fold exposed for too long. Part of the rhythm of the work, then, was the constant, gentle tucking of the loose cloth back under the shelter of your arm, a small habitual motion that you performed without conscious thought. The ship's motion continued its long rocking cadence, and the footrope beneath your boots swayed with it, carrying you out over the grey water and back again in a cycle that was so regular it had become a kind of stillness. Your legs had adjusted to the sway long ago, your knees bending and straightening by tiny degrees to keep your torso relatively steady, and the muscles of your calves and thighs worked in a slow, unconscious pattern that never tired because it never rested either. A continuous, low-level engagement that was as automatic as the beating of your heart. The footrope itself had warmed slightly from the contact with your boots, and the ice that had encased it when you first stepped onto the yard was now melted away in the spots where you stood, leaving the dark, wet hemp exposed to the air. Elsewhere along the yard, the rope still glistened with frost, a long white line that curved away to the yard arms on either side, punctuated at intervals by the dark spots where the other topmen stood. Your progress along the sail was visible now in the form of a growing area of freed canvas that lay bunched loosely over the yard, the pale brown of the damp cloth providing a muted contrast against the white-grey of the still frozen sections on either side. The boundary between the worked and unworked portions was not a clean line, but a ragged, indented front that advanced in small increments, some parts of it pushing further ahead where the ice had been thinner and yielding more slowly where the rime had built up thick and hard. You worked this advancing front methodically, moving from left to right and then from right to left, in a pattern that ensured no spot was missed, no fold left frozen, no patch of ice allowed to remain and refreeze the cloth around it. The other men were making similar advances along their sections, their dark shapes bent over the yard in postures of calm concentration, and the whole yard now held the appearance of a long, slow workshop suspended in the grey air. The cold in your hands had settled into a steady, deep ache that was not precisely painful, but was also not comfortable, a sensation that occupied the middle ground between feeling and numbness, where the nerves still functioned, but the messages they sent were dulled and altered. When you touched the frozen canvas, you felt the cold more as a pressure than a temperature, a hard, insistent presence that pushed against your skin, and when you touched the freed cloth, you felt the dampness more as a weight than a wetness, a heavy, clinging quality that made the fabric difficult to shift. The distinction between these sensations was subtle and often blurred, and you did not trouble yourself to separate them, accepting the general, composite feeling of cold and wet and heavy as the natural condition of your hands during this kind of work at this latitude in this season. A small portion of the sail near the middle of your section had frozen in a particularly stubborn way, the ice having penetrated so deeply into the folds that the canvas had become a single, solid block that resisted all your gentle, patient efforts to break it free. You gave this spot your full attention for a time, pressing it, warming it, working the edges with your fingertips, but the ice held firm and the cloth beneath remained rigid. Without any particular change in your mood, you simply let it be, for now, shifting your work to the less resistant areas on either side, with the understanding that you would return to this stubborn patch later after the surrounding canvas had been freed and the warmth of your body had had more time to work its way into the frozen core. There was no frustration in this decision, no sense of defeat or postponement, only a calm, practical acknowledgement that some parts of a task required more patience than others, and that patience was the one resource you had in limitless supply. The light continued its slow, imperceptible decline toward evening, the grey of the sky deepening by fractional shades that were visible only when you looked away for a while and then looked back, comparing the present sky to your memory of it. The cloud ceiling, which had been a uniform, pale grey all afternoon, now showed subtle variations in tone, patches of slightly darker grey that drifted slowly from west to east, carrying within them the promise of more moisture, more cold, perhaps more ice to come. The temperature had dropped another degree or two, and the moisture in your breath now froze more rapidly when it left your mouth, forming a fine, glittering mist that hung in the air for a moment before dispersing. These small, incremental changes in the world around you were registered and accepted with the same calm, unquestioning attention that you gave to the frozen canvas under your hands, part of the continuous, unbroken fabric of an afternoon at sea off Cape Horn. You paused in your work to straighten your back, lifting your head from its bow position over the yard and letting your gaze travel out across the sea. The view had not changed in any significant way since you had last looked. The same grey water heaving in the same long parallel ridges away to a horizon that was still blurred and indistinct, but the act of looking felt different from the act of working, a small shift in perspective that rested a different part of your mind. The albatross that had been riding the wind far to leeward was still there. Or perhaps it was a different albatross, its shape identical to the one you had seen earlier, its wings still locked in their motionless glide. The foam on the wave crests was a little heavier now, a little whiter against the dark sea, and the wind had backed a point or two, altering the angle of the ship's heel by a degree so subtle that only a man who had spent hours in the rigging would notice. You stored these observations away in a quiet corner of your awareness, adding them to the day's slow accumulation of small, wordless facts. Your body had cooled during the pause, the heat generated by the steady, rhythmic work beginning to dissipate into the cold air, and you felt the chill creeping back into your shoulders and your chest. The remedy for this was simple, and you applied it without hurry, reaching down once more to the frozen canvas and resuming the steady, patient cycle of melting and pulling, warming and freeing, gathering and bunching, the work drawing you back into its rhythm as naturally as the tide draws water back from a beach. The sail, which had seemed so vast and unyielding when you first arrived on the yard, was now perhaps a quarter freed, the bunched cloth forming a substantial damp mass against the spar, and the remainder of the task stretched ahead of you in a calm, unhurried sequence of more of the same, nothing more and nothing less. The freed canvas that now lay bunched against the yard in damp, heavy folds represented perhaps a third of the total cloth that would eventually need to be gathered and secured, and the work of drawing the remaining frozen sail toward you continued in its steady, methodical rhythm without any change of pace or intention. The portion of the sail that you had already released from the grip of the frost was no longer a single, rigid sheet, but a collection of loose, overlapping layers that moved slightly with the ship's roll, their damp surfaces sliding against one another with a low, liquid sound that was entirely different from the hard crackle of the still frozen sections. These loose layers had to be managed as you worked, kept from slipping back over the yard and into the wind, and your left arm now served as a sort of living clamp, pressing the gathered cloth against the spar, while your right hand continued to reach down for fresh holds on the frozen canvas below. The process of drawing the stiff canvas in had become the entire world of your senses, a small, complete universe bounded on one side by the cold, rough surface of the yard and on the other by the pale, unyielding wall of the sail. Each time you reached down, your fingers encountered a different texture, a different degree of resistance, and your hand learned to read these differences with the same quiet precision that a blind man uses to read a page of raised letters. Some patches of ice were so hard and glassy that your fingers could find no purchase at all, and you had to press your palm flat against the surface and let the heat work for a longer time before attempting a grip. Other patches were already softening from the warmth that had traveled down through the canvas from your earlier efforts, and these yielded almost at once, the ice crumbling away in small wet granules that clung to your glove like damp sand. The canvas itself varied from spot to spot as well, some areas still carrying the stiff, board-like quality of deep frozen cloth, while others had taken on a leathery flexibility that allowed them to bend but not yet to fold. The rhythm of the draw was a thing of 4 distinct parts that repeated in an unbroken cycle, and though you never counted the parts or named them to yourself, they existed in your muscles as a familiar sequence of small, necessary motions. The first part was the reach, the extension of your arm downward, with the fingers already slightly curved in anticipation of the grip to come, the shoulder rotating forward, and the spine bending a fraction more to give the arm its full length. The second part was the contact, the settling of your palm and fingers against the cold, hard surface of the ice, a moment of stillness in which the heat began its invisible work, and your hand read the texture of what it had found. The third part was the close, The gradual curling of your fingers around whatever fold or ridge or edge they had located, the tightening of your grip from loose to firm, the slow application of pulling force. And the fourth part was the draw itself, the steady, sustained heave that brought the canvas up toward the yard inch by inch, the ice along its base cracking and breaking as the fabric bent and shifted and came free. During the draw, you felt the resistance of the canvas as a sort of communication between the sail and your body, a wordless report on the state of the ice and the cloth that traveled up through your arm and into your shoulder and your back. When the resistance was heavy and even, as it was when you pulled against a thick, deeply frozen section, you leaned into the pull more with your body, engaging the muscles of your back and your legs to apply a slow, steady force that would not jerk or tear the fabric. When the resistance was lighter, as it became when you worked on the thinner, partially melted edges of the frozen areas, you used less force and let the pull be guided more by your wrist and forearm, a smaller, neater motion that brought the cloth up in shorter increments. And when the resistance ended suddenly, as it did when an ice bond broke all at once, your body absorbed the release without faltering, maintaining the steady rate of pull so that the canvas came smoothly to rest against the yard. The sound of the work had its own quiet music, a score composed of many small overlapping noises that played against the deep, continuous drone of the wind. The hardest, most frozen sections gave off a sharp, splintering crack when they finally yielded, a sound like a thin branch being snapped under a boot, and this crack was often followed by a brief, musical shower of ice particles falling away. The partially frozen sections produced a softer, more prolonged noise, a rustling, grinding sound that reminded you of a cartwheel turning slowly over a gravel path, the ice crystals rubbing against one another as the canvas fibers began to slide. The already damp folds that you pressed against the yard made almost no sound at all, beyond a faint wet whisper as they settled into place, and this whisper was often lost entirely under the larger noises of the ship and the sea. Together these sounds formed a constantly shifting pattern that rose and fell in a slow, irregular cadence, and you heard it without listening, your ears receiving the information and filing it away in the same wordless warehouse where your eyes stored the color of the sky. The ship continued to roll through the long, heavy swells, and each roll affected the work in a small but noticeable way, the tension on the canvas changing as the mast leaned away from the vertical and then returned. On the leeward rolls, the sail would sag slightly away from you, pulling down on your grip and requiring a firmer hold to keep the canvas from slipping back, while on the windward rolls the cloth would press toward you, pushed by the wind against your hands and against the yard, making the draw fractionally easier. You adapted to these changes without thought, your body timing its pulls to the rhythm of the ship as naturally as your lungs timed their breathing to the rhythm of your pulse, and the work flowed on through the peaks and troughs of each swell with an unbroken, liquid continuity. The cold that had been a steady, patient presence since you first climbed into the rigging now began to take on a slightly different character as the afternoon wore on and your body spent more of its heat in the long, slow labor of drawing the canvas. The chill no longer came only from the outside, from the ice and the wind and the cold, damp fabric. It also began to grow from within, as the steady expenditure of energy used up the warmth that your heart and your blood and your working muscles were producing. You felt this not as a sudden change, but as a gradual creeping coolness that spread from your core outward, making your shoulders feel heavy and your back feel stiff. And you countered it without thought by working a little more steadily, the motion of your muscles generating just enough extra heat to keep the inner cold at bay. The balance between the cold outside and the warmth inside was a delicate, constantly shifting equilibrium that you maintained with the same unconscious skill that kept you balanced on the foot rope, and it required neither attention nor effort. Only the quiet, animal patience of a body that knew how to survive in this high, frozen place. The canvas that came up from the frozen sail was heavy with moisture that had not been able to drain or dry since the freeze began, and as you drew each new handful up to the yard, you added its weight to the growing mass of cloth that lay bunched against the spar. This mass was now substantial enough that it formed a sort of cushion between your chest and the yard, a thick, damp bolster that changed the posture of your body slightly, pushing you back from the spar by an inch or two, and altering the angle of your reach toward the remaining frozen sections. You would occasionally pause to resettle this mass, shifting it a little to the left or right, patting it down with the heel of your hand to make it more compact. And each of these small adjustments was a moment of rest in its own right, a brief variation in the steady rhythm of the draw that gave your shoulders and your back a slightly different pattern of movement. The other topmen along the yard were each at their own stage of the same work, their bodies moving through the same four-part rhythm in a quiet, scattered unison that had no conductor and no score. The man to your left had advanced his front of freed canvas further than yours, the bunched cloth on his section of the yard forming a thicker, more even roll that spoke of a slightly faster pace or slightly thinner ice, while the man to your right was a little behind, his section still showing large areas of white, unbroken rime that would require another quarter-hour of patient work. These differences were noted without judgment or comparison, accepted as natural variations in a task that had no fixed rate and no expected completion time, the only measure being that the work proceeds steadily and without error. From time to time, a small piece of ice would break free from the sail and fall, not straight down, but in a drifting, tumbling path that the wind caught and carried to leeward, and you would see the white speck diminishing against the grey water until it vanished into the long, rolling trough between waves. Some of these pieces were large enough that they would have stung had they struck your face, and you ducked your head slightly when a particularly thick section of rime cracked away near your shoulder, but the precaution was more a formality than a necessity, for the wind carried almost everything clear of the men on the yard. The sea below received these offerings without comment, the small white fragments floating for a moment on the dark surface and then melting into invisibility, returning to the salt water from which they had come. The stubborn patch near the middle of your section, the one you had passed over earlier when its deep freeze resisted all your gentle efforts, had now been surrounded on three sides by freed, flexible canvas, and the warmth from your work on the surrounding areas had slowly percolated through the fibers into the frozen center. When you returned your attention to this patch, you found that it had softened considerably, the ice still present but no longer monolithic, its internal structure weakened by the slow migration of heat through the weave. You took hold of it with both hands, one on each side of the stiffened fold, and you began to work it back and forth in a gentle rocking motion, bending the canvas first toward you and then away, in short, shallow arcs that gradually increased in amplitude as the ice within the fibers began to crack and separate. This rocking continued for perhaps a minute, the canvas groaning faintly with each flex, and then the whole frozen section gave way at once, with a sound like a heavy sheet of paper being torn, the ice shattering into a spray of coarse white granules that scattered down the face of the sail and left the cloth beneath soft and pliable and ready to be drawn up to the yard. The satisfaction of this small resolution was not a sharp feeling, but a quiet, diffuse warmth that settled somewhere in your chest and faded almost at once, replaced by the calm, neutral attention that the next handful of canvas demanded. You drew the newly freed cloth up to join the rest of the bunched mass, padding it into place with the same level, unhurried pressure you had used 100 times already, and then you reached down again, your hand finding the next cold, hard fold, your fingers curling around it, the rhythm of the draw continuing without interruption. The light had faded another shade toward the deeper grey of early evening, and the visibility of the more distant parts of the rigging had begun to soften, the lines and spars of the mizzenmast losing their crispness and blending into the uniform, dim backdrop of the sky. The lanterns on deck had not yet been lit, or if they had, their glow was too faint to reach your position on the yard, but the residual daylight was still more than adequate for the work, which relied far more on the sense of touch than on vision. Your hands knew the texture of the ice and the cloth, knew how much force to apply and how long to wait, and they would have been able to continue the task in complete darkness if the need had arisen. The thought of continuing in darkness was not a frightening one, but merely a practical observation, stored away with all the other practical observations that had accumulated during the afternoon. The wind, which had been shifting in small gusts for some time, now settled back into a steadier, more consistent blow, and the consequent steadiness of the ship's heel made the work slightly easier, the foot rope swaying less and the canvas hanging more predictably as you reached down for each new hold. The steady wind also carried a new quality of cold, a slightly drier, more piercing quality that suggested the temperature had dropped another fraction of a degree during the last half hour, and you felt the difference most keenly in the tips of your ears, where the wool of your cap had grown thin, and the skin was exposed to the full force of the moving air. You tucked your chin a little lower into your collar, a small automatic adjustment that made the difference bearable, and the work continued without pause. The distance you'd advanced across your section of sail was now more than half the total area, the freed cloth forming a substantial roll that extended from the left boundary of your section nearly to the right, with only a few scattered patches of white, frozen canvas remaining to be drawn in. These remaining patches were the deepest and most reluctant sections of all, the cloth that had been folded and tucked and compressed by the wind into dense multi-layered blocks of ice and fabric that had the solidity of old timber, and they would require the longest warming and the steadiest pulling to bring free. You approached them with the same calm, methodical patience that you had brought to every other part of the task, your hand reaching down, your fingers reading the surface, your grip closing slowly and firmly, the draw beginning with a patient, steady force that asked without demanding and waited, without hurry, for the response that would come in its own time. The canvas that lay across the yard in front of you had now grown into a deep, uneven mass of damp cloth, its folds overlapping one another in a loose, tangled heap that rose nearly to your chest in places and fell away to a thin, single layer in others. The work of drawing the frozen canvas up from the sail was nearly complete, with only a few remaining patches of stiff, white fabric still clinging to the lower portion of your section, and the focus of the task had begun to shift from pulling free to gathering in, from the long-reaching draw to the shorter, more compact motions of bunching and folding the cloth into a shape that would lie snugly against the yard. This transition happened without any signal or decision, the rhythm of the work simply altering by small degrees as the proportion of freed canvas increased, and the need to compact what had been gathered became more pressing. The first motion of the bunching phase was to take the loose, trailing edge of the gathered cloth and fold it upward, laying it over the top of the mass that already rested against the yard, and pressing it down with a firm, even pressure from the heel of your hand. The cloth at this stage was cold and wet, but no longer frozen, and it folded with a heavy, reluctant drape, the way a sodden blanket folds when lifted from a basin of water. The outer surface of the canvas, the part that had been exposed to the freezing spray for days, still carried a thin, granular crust of salt crystals that crumbled and fell away as you handled it, leaving a fine white dust on your gloves and on the darker cloth beneath, while the inner surface, the part that had been pressed against the other folds, was smoother and darker and held the moisture in a more even, saturating way. Each time you laid a new fold over the mass and pressed it down, a small quantity of water squeezed out of the cloth and ran in a thin, cold trickle over your glove and down your wrist, where it was quickly cooled by the wind until it felt like a line of ice drawn across your skin. The folding and pressing continued in a steady, repetitive cycle that was simpler than the draw, but no less demanding of attention, because each fold had to be laid in the right direction and pressed firmly enough to compact the mass, without trapping pockets of air that might later catch the wind and work the cloth loose. You worked from the left side of your section toward the right, taking the loose canvas in both hands and folding it inward toward the center of the yard, building up a dense, compact roll that grew thicker and more solid with each successive layer. The roll was not perfectly cylindrical, but somewhat flatter on the bottom where it rested against the yard, and more rounded on the top where the layers overlapped, and its surface was uneven, marked by the ridges and seams of the individual folds, which you smoothed and patted down as you went along with the same absent-minded care that a baker uses to shape a loaf of dough. The other topmen along the yard were engaged in the same task, their bodies bowed over the spar in postures of quiet concentration, their arms moving through the same short, repetitive motions of folding and pressing, and the sound of their work joined with yours to create a low, continuous rustling that was punctuated at intervals by the soft, wet slap of a fold being laid down firmly, or the faint, grinding crunch of a patch of residual ice being crushed under a pressing palm. The foot rope swayed with the ship's roll in its unchanging rhythm, and your body swayed with it, the motion now so familiar that it had become a part of your stillness, a moving balance that required no correction and no awareness, the same way you balanced on solid ground without ever thinking about the pull of the earth. The bunching of the canvas was a task that brought different muscles into play than the drawing had done, using more of the forearms and the wrists and the small, precise muscles of the hands, rather than the larger muscles of the back and shoulders that had been engaged during the long, reaching pulls. You felt this shift as a subtle change in the pattern of warmth and fatigue in your body, the ache in your shoulders gradually receding while a newer, tighter sensation began to settle into your forearms and the base of your thumbs. This sensation was not painful, but simply present. A low, humming awareness of the work your hands were doing, and you acknowledged it in the same way you acknowledged the cold and the wind and the grey light as part of the steady, ongoing texture of the afternoon. The roll of canvas grew thicker and more compact as you continued to fold and press, its outer surface becoming smoother and more uniform as the loose flaps and trailing edges were tucked in and secured under the pressure of your hands. The roll was now dense enough that it resisted further compression, the layers of wet cloth packed so tightly together that squeezing one part caused another part to bulge outward, and this told you without any need for measurement that the cloth had been gathered as much as it could be gathered in its current state, and that the next phase of the work, the tying of the gaskets, would soon begin. But before the gaskets could be applied, there was one more round of small finishing adjustments to be made, the final smoothing and shaping of the roll that would ensure the wind could find no purchase and the ice could form no new bridge between the cloth and the yard. You began this final shaping by walking your hands slowly along the length of the roll, pressing down firmly at regular intervals and feeling for any soft spots or loose areas where the cloth had not been tucked in tightly enough. When you found such a spot, you would pause and work it with your fingers, pushing the loose cloth inward and pressing it down until it merged with the surrounding layers, and the whole surface felt uniformly firm and solid under your palm. This process was slow and methodical, a final, careful pass over the work that was less about adding new folds and more about refining and securing what had already been done, the same way a carpenter runs a plane over a finished joint, not to change its shape, but to ensure its smoothness. The cold had by now numbed your fingers sufficiently that the sense of touch was dulled and distant, but the pressure of the cloth against your palm was still discernible, still legible, and your hands read the surface of the roll with the same patient, wordless attention they had used to read the texture of the frozen canvas an hour before. Occasionally, a gust of wind would catch a loose fiber or a small corner of cloth that had escaped the general compaction and lift it slightly, a brief, fluttering movement that drew your eye and your hand to the spot at once, the correction made almost before the movement had registered in your mind. These small interruptions were the only variation in the otherwise steady, rhythmic flow of the bunching work, and they did not disturb the calm of the task any more than a pebble disturbs the surface of a pond, a momentary ripple that faded almost at once into the larger pattern of stillness that surrounded it. You tucked the last of the loose edges under the roll and smoothed the whole surface one more time with the flat of your hand, the cloth feeling cool and heavy and completely settled, ready for what would come next. The ship gave a long, groaning roll to leeward just as you finished the final smoothing, and the deep, resonant creak of the mast, stepping in its partners, travelled up through the yard and into your chest, a low, animal sound that seemed to come from the very centre of the vessel. The canvas roll shifted slightly with the roll but held its shape, the friction between the layers and the pressure of your body keeping it in place against the yard, and you felt a quiet, wordless sense that the cloth was now properly gathered, the task of bunching and folding complete. This sense was not satisfaction or pride, but simply acknowledgement, the same quiet recognition that a day's work had brought you to a particular point, no more and no less. You rested for a moment then, not because you were weary in any urgent way, but because the pause was the natural bridge between one phase of the work and the next, a brief, still interlude in which your hands lay motionless on the cold, damp canvas and your eyes turned outward to the sea. The horizon was now barely visible, the grey of the water merging into the grey of the sky with no clear boundary, and the quality of the light had dropped to that deep, thick dimness that precedes the true onset of night at these latitudes. The waves were still the same, still rolling in their long, heavy procession from west to east, still capped with the same pale, intermittent foam, and the albatross that had been riding the wind all afternoon was now joined by a second bird, smaller and lighter in colour, the two of them tracing slow, banking circles far to leeward that seemed to have no purpose and no end. You watched them for a moment without thought, simply letting the image of their flight settle into your mind, and then you turned back to the yard, where the gaskets hung waiting in their dark, frozen coils, the next small task already presenting itself in its calm, unhurried way. The gaskets hung from the yard in long, dark loops, the tarred hemp stiffened by the cold into shapes that remembered every coil and knot they had ever been tied into, and they swayed very slightly with the ship's motion. A slow, pendulous movement that drew the eye without holding it. You had passed these lengths of cordage 100 times during the drawing and bunching of the canvas, your shoulder brushing against them, your arm pushing them aside as you reached down for another handful of frozen cloth. And now they were to become the focus of your attention for the next small portion of the afternoon. There were 5 gaskets spaced evenly along your section of the yard, each one secured at one end to the spar itself and left hanging free at the other end in a length of perhaps 4 feet, more than enough to pass around the bunched canvas and tie off with a particular series of hitches that would hold the sail through any blow the horn might bring. You took hold of the first gasket, the one nearest the left boundary of your section, and the cordage was so cold that it felt almost brittle in your hand. The tar that normally gave it a slight, pliable tackiness, now frozen into a hard, glossy shell that crackled when you bent the rope. The ice that had formed on the surface of the gasket was thin but complete, a continuous, transparent skin that followed every twist of the strands and made the rope look as though it had been dipped in glass. And when you closed your fingers around it, this skin shattered into a fine, dark powder of frozen tar and ice that fell away into the wind. Beneath the frozen surface, the hemp was still sound, still strong, its fibers dry and tight from the cold, but perfectly capable of holding a knot, and you began to work it gently back and forth between your hands to restore its flexibility, the same way you might warm a strip of leather before stitching it. The gasket softened under your handling, the heat of your gloves transferring slowly into the dense, twisted fibers and loosening the stiffness that the cold had driven into them, and after a minute of this gentle, rhythmic flexing, the rope was as pliable as it needed to be for the task ahead. You drew the free end across your body, passing it over the top of the bunched canvas and letting it fall down the far side of the roll, where you caught it with your left hand and pulled it through until an equal length hung on either side. The canvas compressed slightly under the pressure of the gasket, a soft, wet sigh of squeezed air and water escaping from the folds, and then the rope settled into place against the cloth, the dark line of it standing out sharply against the pale, damp brown of the sail, like a line of ink drawn across a page of old paper. The first motion of the tie was to pass the free end of the gasket under the yard itself, reaching down beneath the spar and feeling for the dangling rope with your cold, numbed fingers. Your hand, working in a space you could not see but knew perfectly well from the memory stored in your muscles. The rope was there, hanging just where you expected it, and you pulled it up and toward you, bringing it around the front of the canvas roll and back to the starting point. This created a single, complete loop that encircled both the canvas and the yard, and you pulled it snug with a slow, steady force that compressed the cloth further and pressed the roll firmly against the spar. The gasket creaked as it tightened, a low, fibrous sound that was the voice of the hemp strands rubbing together under tension, and you held that tension for a moment to let the rope settle into its new shape before beginning the knot itself. The knot you tied was not a single swift gesture, but a series of small, deliberate actions that each required its own moment of attention and its own careful adjustment. You crossed the free end over the standing part, forming a loop, then passed the end under and through, pulling it tight until the first half hitch lay flat against the canvas with the clean, neat look that spoke of a secure hold. The second half hitch followed in the same unhurried way, the rope passing over and under and through in the same ancient pattern that sailors had been tying since the first sail was bent to the first yard, in some sea far older than this one, and when you pulled it tight, the 2 hitches locked together in a low, compact knot that would not slip under strain. You tested the knot by pressing your thumb against it and pushing gently outward, feeling for any give or looseness, and the knot held firm, the hemp already beginning to stiffen again in the cold air. With the first gasket secured, you shifted your weight a step to the right, shuffling sideways along the footrope with the same careful inch-by-inch motion that you had used to move along the yard all afternoon. your inner arm sliding over the wood of the spar, and your free hand reaching out for the next dangling length of cordage. The second gasket was thinner than the first, its hemp more worn from years of use and its tar coating rubbed away in places to reveal the paler, tan-colored fibers beneath. But it was still strong and still serviceable, and you took it in hand and began the same gentle flexing and warming that you had applied to its predecessor. The cold had settled into this gasket in exactly the same way, the thin skin of ice crackling away under your touch, the fibers beneath stiff but responsive, and the familiarity of the task made it flow easily from your hands, the motions repeating with the quiet, unthinking precision of long practice. The second gasket passed around the canvas and under the yard and back again, in exactly the same pattern as the first had done, the rope following the path your hands directed with a smooth, unhurried compliance, and when you tightened it you felt the canvas roll compress another fraction, the whole mass of cloth becoming slightly denser and more compact with each successive tie. The knot formed under your fingers with the same two half hitches, the same firm, flat lay against the canvas, the same testing pressure of your thumb confirming its security, and then you were moving on to the third gasket, the one in the very center of your section, which hung directly in front of your chest where the bunched canvas was thickest and most substantial. The third gasket was the heaviest of the five, a thicker, newer length of cordage that had been replaced during the last refit in Portsmouth and had not yet been worn down by the constant chafing of wind and weather, and the extra thickness made it slightly stiffer, slightly more resistant to your efforts to bend it around the canvas. You took a little more time with this one, working the frozen tar from the strands with slow, patient passes of your glove, letting the warmth of your hand sink deeper into the core of the rope before you attempted to pull it tight. The canvas beneath this gasket was the thickest part of the row, the place where all the folds overlapped and came together in a dense, heavy mass, and when you drew the gasket around it and began to tighten the loop, you felt the resistance of all that compressed cloth pushing back against the rope, a firm, springy pressure that required a steadier pull and a longer moment of sustained effort before the gasket lay snugly in place. The knot on the center gasket was tied with the same careful, unhurried precision as the others, the half-hitches forming one after the other in their familiar intertwined shape, and when you pressed your thumb against the finished knot, it felt as solid as the yard itself, a small, perfect compression of rope and friction that would hold the canvas through gale and calm alike. You allowed yourself a brief pause after this third gasket, your hands resting on the cold, damp surface of the roll, while your eyes traveled along the length of the yard to check the alignment of the work so far. The three gaskets you had tied stood at even intervals, their dark vertical lines dividing the canvas roll into neat, proportional sections, and they matched the gaskets that the other topman had tied on either side of your section, the whole yard now showing a regular, orderly pattern of tied canvas that stretched from one yard arm to the other in an unbroken line. The fourth gasket was much like the second, worn and thinner, but still sound, and you tied it with the same steady, methodical rhythm that you had brought to all the others, the motions now so familiar that your hands seemed to work almost independently of your mind, the fingers passing and looping and pulling with a calm, automatic competence that required no direction and no thought. The fifth and final gasket, the one at the right boundary of your section, was the easiest of all because it marked the end of the tying task, the completion of the long sequence that had begun with the first grip on the frozen canvas and was now arriving at its natural conclusion. You tied it carefully, not hurrying even though the end was in sight, giving the final knot the same attention and the same testing pressure that you had given the first. And when it was done, you let your hands rest on the canvas roll for a long, still moment, feeling the ship breathe beneath you and the wind hum past your ears. The entire topsail was now furled along the yard in a long, continuous cylinder of pale brown canvas, studded at regular intervals with the dark, vertical bars of the gaskets. A neat and orderly arrangement, the spoke of many hands working together in the same calm, patient rhythm. The sail that had been a frozen, unyielding wall when you first reached the yard was now a compact, manageable bundle that would shed the wind and shed the ice and hold secure through the coming night. The transformation was a small one in the great scheme of the sea and the sky and the long voyage, but it was the work that the day had called for, and it was done, and the quiet, wordless fact of its completion settled over the yard like a soft, grey blanket. The final gasket lay flat and snug against the canvas, its two half-hitches settled one atop the other, with the neat, compact look of a knot that would not slip. And you kept your thumb pressed against it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, feeling the cold, hard resistance of the compressed cloth beneath the rope. This small point of contact between your hand and the sail was the last task in the long sequence that had occupied your body and your attention since you first closed your fingers around a frozen fold. And now that it was complete, there was no immediate next thing, no further action waiting to be taken. Only the quiet, open interval that came between the end of one piece of work and the beginning of whatever might follow. You removed your thumb from the knot and let your arm rest along the top of the bunched canvas, the damp cloth cool against the worn leather of your sleeve, and you began the slow, careful inspection that was the natural conclusion of any furling job. Your eyes travelled along the whole length of the furled sail, from the left boundary of your section to the right, tracing the contours of the canvas roll where it bulged slightly between the gaskets and flattened down at each tie. The surface of the roll was not perfectly smooth, for the fabric that had been frozen and refrozen many times over the past days had a memory of its former shape that kept it from lying completely flat, and small ridges and puckers remained visible under the dark, crisscrossing patterns of the gaskets. You examined each of these irregularities with a calm, unhurried gaze, assessing whether any of them was large enough to catch the wind or deep enough to trap moisture that would freeze again in the night, and one by one you concluded that they were harmless. The natural texture of a sail that had been worked by many hands in a cold sea, not the sort of flaw that would shake loose in a blow. The inspection took several minutes, though you did not count them, and by the time your eyes reached the far side of your section, the light had dimmed yet another shade toward the deep, thick dusk of the high latitudes. Beyond your own section, the other topmen had done their work with the same steady patience, and the entire length of the topsail yard now carried a single continuous roll of pale brown canvas, punctuated at even intervals by the darker bars of the gaskets, a pattern that repeated from the port yard arm all the way to the starboard. The uniformity of the furled sail was satisfying in a quiet, wordless way, the kind of satisfaction that came not from pride in individual achievement, but from the sight of many small tasks converging into a single, orderly whole. The frozen wall of white that had greeted you when you first hooked your arm over the yard was now entirely transformed, reduced and compacted into a manageable shape that would hold through the coming night and the next day, and however many more days it might take to round the Horn and turn north into the warmer latitudes. The ice that remained on the sail was now locked safely inside the tight folds of the roll, where it would melt slowly and drain away without adding its weight to the strain on the yard. The ship herself had altered her motion under the reduced canvas, the deep, groaning heel to leeward becoming less pronounced now that the topsail no longer presented its full, rigid face to the wind, and the long pendulous roll that had accompanied every swell for the past hours had settled into a slightly shorter, slightly steadier rhythm. You could feel the difference in the way the footrope swayed beneath your boots, and in the reduced vibration that travelled up through the mast, a subtle change that might have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent the afternoon aloft, but which spoke clearly to your sea-trained senses of a vessel no longer fighting her canvas, now moving through the water with a smoother, more balanced gait. The wind still pressed against your back and still hummed its endless note through the rigging, but the note itself had shifted down a tone, the tauter, higher-pitched whistle of overstrained shrouds giving way to a fuller, more rounded sound that was easier on the ear and on the nerves. You looked out beyond the bow and saw the sea stretching away in long, uneven ridges that the low light had coloured in layered shades of iron and slate, darker in the troughs where the shadow gathered, and paler on the crests where the last of the daylight caught the foam. The horizon, which had been a blurred, uncertain boundary for much of the afternoon, was now sharpening slightly as the cloud layer thinned toward evening, revealing a thin, pale line where the water ended and the sky began, though the sky itself remained a uniform, dusky grey that held no hint of the sunset that must be painting itself somewhere far to the west. The waves rolled in their eternal procession, each one a small heaving hill of water that lifted the ship by the bow and passed under her keel and rolled on toward the east without ever breaking rhythm. And you watched them with a detached, almost idle attention, your mind no longer occupied with the small, precise demands of the task that had filled it for the past hours. Far to leeward the albatross was still there, The same bird you had noticed during the climb and perhaps earlier from the deck. Its great, narrow wings spread in a motionless arc that rode the wind without a single flap, a perfect, effortless suspension between the grey sea and the grey sky. A second albatross had joined it now, this one slightly smaller and carrying a faint smudge of darker color on the underside of its wings, and the two birds turned in a wide, slow circle around each other, their paths intersecting and diverging in a pattern that seemed to have no purpose and no end. You watched them for a long, quiet moment, following their lazy arcs across the darkening air, and the sight of them brought no particular thought or feeling, only the simple, receptive awareness that comes when the mind has been stilled by steady work and cold and the long, rhythmic rocking of the sea. The birds would be there when the darkness fell, and they would be there when the light returned, as constant in their own way as the waves and the wind and the patient, groaning timbers of the ship. The cold that had been a steady companion all afternoon had now settled deeply into every part of your body that was exposed to the air, your cheeks and the bridge of your nose and the rims of your ears, all registering not pain, but a dense, cottony numbness that seemed to muffle the world slightly, as though a thin layer of wool had been laid between your skin and the wind. Your breath still plumed in front of your face, in clouds of vapor that the wind tore away, but the plumes were thinner now, the cold having dried the air so that the moisture condensed less visibly. And the vapor vanished almost at once instead of hanging for the brief second it had held when you first climbed aloft. The ice that had formed on your eyelashes earlier had now built into a fine, white fringe that sparkled at the edges of your vision each time you blinked, and when you pressed your lips together, you could feel the faint, gritty texture of salt crystals that had settled there from the spray and frozen into place. All these small discomforts were present, but distant, as though they belonged to someone else's face, someone else's cold fingers, and you observed them with the same detached, clinical attention that you might give to a description in a book. You shifted your weight on the foot rope, moving your right foot a few inches outward and your left foot a few inches in, and the small adjustment sent a tingle of returning warmth through the soles of your boots as the blood began to circulate more freely. The foot rope creaked under the change of load, a low, familiar sound that joined the other sounds of the ship in their quiet, ongoing chorus, and you felt the hemp fibers settle into their new position and hold firm. Your inner arm, still hooked over the yard, had grown stiff in its fixed posture, and you flexed it slowly, straightening the elbow and then bending it again, working the cold out of the joint with the same patient, practical attention you had given to every other small movement of the afternoon. The yard itself felt warmer now where your body had been pressed against it all this time, the wood having absorbed enough of your heat to lose its initial stony chill, and when you laid your cheek against the spar for a brief moment, the surface felt almost mild, almost welcoming, a small pocket of relative warmth in the vast, cold expanse of the upper rigging. No order to come down had been given yet, and in the absence of any such word, you remained where you were, suspended between the darkening sea and the darkening sky, your body swaying in the same slow rhythm as the mast and the yard and the whole heavy, complex structure of the ship. There was no urgency to leave the height, no pressing need to regain the deck and seek the shelter of the forecastle or the warmth of the galley stove, for the work had been done and the sail was secure, and the next thing would announce itself in its own time. The long, quiet pause that followed the completion of a task was as much a part of the rhythm of shipboard life as the task itself, a space for the body to settle and the mind to rest and the senses to open outward to the wider world that had been narrowed for so long to the span of a yard and the texture of frozen canvas. You let your gaze drift upward to the topmast that rose from the center of the top and continued its taper into the grey sky, where the topgallant yard and the royal yard were visible as two dark, slender lines against the pale cloud, their own sails also furled and frozen, their own gaskets tied and secure. Above them, the truck of the mast seemed to brush against the very ceiling of the sky, a tiny, dark point that swayed through a much larger arc than the deck below, describing a slow, lazy circle against the featureless grey as the ship rolled and pitched through the endless procession of swells. The sight of the masthead swaying was one that always held a strange, quiet fascination, a visible demonstration of the forces that were invisible at deck level, and you watched it for a time without thinking, letting the slow, pendulous motion draw your attention into a calm, almost hypnotic state that was neither sleep nor waking, but somewhere in between. The sounds of the ship at this height had a different quality than they did on deck, the individual noises blending together into a single continuous hum that was more felt than heard. A low vibrational presence that seemed to come from the wood and the rope and the air itself. The wind was the loudest of the sounds, a steady, hollow roar that filled the ears and dulled all other frequencies to a muted background. But beneath the wind, there was the creak of the blocks and the groan of the stays and the faint, rhythmic slap of loose canvas somewhere far below, all of them mingling into a texture of sound that was as constant and as unremarkable as silence. You had been hearing this texture for so many hours that it had become the baseline of your awareness, the auditory equivalent of the grey light and the cold air and the slow rocking motion of the ship, and you would have noticed its absence far more readily than you noticed its presence. The colour of the sea had deepened another degree while you were looking elsewhere, the iron grey of the afternoon shifting into a darker, cooler slate that seemed to absorb the remaining light rather than reflect it, so that the waves looked heavy and dense as they rolled under the ship's counter and onward toward the night. The foam on the crests was the only brightness left on the water, a pale, intermittent gleam that appeared and vanished in a constant scattered pattern, and even this was dimming as the cloud layer thickened again and the last residual glow of the hidden sun faded out of the sky. The temperature had dropped another fraction, the cold intensifying just enough that the sensation of numbness on your cheeks deepened from a surface awareness to a more penetrating dullness that reached into the flesh and the bone, and you turned your face slightly away from the wind to spare the exposed skin. A small instinctive adjustment that made the difference between manageable discomfort and something sharper. A voice, thin and distant, reached your ear from somewhere on the deck far below. The words so stretched and blurred by the wind that they were no more than a shape of sound, a rising and falling intonation that might have been an order or a question or simply a call to a mate. You listened for a repetition, but none came, and after a moment the silence of the height closed back in around you, the brief interruption fading into the larger, ongoing quiet that had held you since the work was completed. The voice had reminded you that the world below was still there, still turning through its own rhythms of watches and bells and the small necessary tasks of navigation and trim, and the reminder was a gentle one, not a summons or a demand, but merely a fact, a small thread connecting your high, isolated perch to the life of the vessel that carried you. You allowed your eyes to sweep one final time along the length of the furled sail, checking once more the set of the gaskets and the tightness of the rolling, confirming for your own quiet satisfaction that nothing had shifted since your last inspection. The roll of canvas was as firm and as compact as it had been when you tied the last knot, the dark lines of the gaskets still straight and even, the pale brown cloth still tightly compressed beneath them, and the whole arrangement gave off an air of permanence and security that was deeply calming to behold. The sail would hold. The ice would melt inside its folded layers and drain away through the scuppers when the weather warmed, and the yard would ride easier now that its burden was reduced and balanced, and the ship would continue her long, slow progress through the grey waters of the Horn with one less task left undone, one less loose end trailing in the wind. A long, slow breath passed through your chest, not a sigh or a yawn, but simply a breath. The same quiet, automatic exchange of air that had been sustaining your body all afternoon, without any particular attention from your mind. And as the breath left you, it carried with it a subtle, diffuse weariness that had been accumulating in the background of your awareness since the climb began. The weariness was not exhaustion, but rather a deep, comfortable tiredness of the muscles and the bones, the kind that came after many hours of steady, purposeful exertion in the cold and the wind, and it settled over you like a heavy blanket laid across the shoulders. You did not fight it or welcome it. You simply noted its arrival and allowed it to be, the same way you allowed the cold to be, and the wind to be, and the slow darkening sea to be. The albatrosses had drifted further to leeward during your inspection, their dark shapes now small and indistinct against the slate-coloured water, but you could still make out their motionless, soaring flight as they banked in those same wide, lazy circles that seemed to require no effort and no intent. They were perhaps the loneliest creatures you had ever seen, and yet there was nothing sad about them, nothing that asked for pity or sympathy, for they were as perfectly fitted to this cold grey world as the ship was to the sea or the ice was to the canvas. They simply were, as you simply were, two different orders of being, sharing for a brief time the same empty stretch of ocean and the same fading light. And the thought of this shared presence was not a profound one, but a quiet, gentle one, a small piece of comfort, in the place where comfort was scarce and unnecessary. You tightened your grip on the yard one more time, feeling the rough, cold grain of the wood beneath your glove, and you looked straight down past the furled canvas to the deck that lay so far below, its planks dark and wet in the gathering dusk, the figures of the men moving upon it reduced to slow, small shapes that seemed to drift rather than walk. The hatch covers were still battened, the boats still secured, the galley stack still sending up its thin, brave thread of smoke that was torn sideways by the wind before it could climb 10 feet, and the whole scene had the look of a painting rendered in shades of brown and grey, a quiet, still composition that might have been the work of some patient, long-forgotten hand. You did not watch it for long, for your eyes were drawn back up to the horizon and the sea and the vast, moving emptiness that surrounded the ship on all sides, an emptiness that was not hostile or frightening, but simply there, simply part of the world, as neutral and as constant as gravity itself. And so you remained on the yard, not because you had to and not because you were waiting for anything in particular, but because the height was a place of its own quiet integrity, and there was no reason yet to leave it. The cold and the wind and the slow, rocking sway of the mast had become a sort of home over the past hours, a small, suspended world where nothing was demanded of you except presence and patience, and you gave both. Without counting the cost, the descent would come when it came, and the deck would receive you when you reached it, and the ship would carry you onward through the night and into whatever weather the next day might bring. But for now there was only this, the yard, the furled sail, the darkening sky, and the long, slow look that asked for nothing but returned everything. The order to lay down came without any particular announcement, a low, calm word that passed from mouth to mouth along the yard in a murmur, barely louder than the wind, reaching your ears as a soft, familiar shape of sound that required no translation and no response beyond the simple, unhurried movement it invited. You heard the man to your left repeat the word to you, and you passed it on to the man on your right in the same toneless, matter-of-fact voice, and then the word drifted away into the rigging and was gone, its work already done. The command was not a call to haste or a release from duty, but simply a quiet acknowledgement that the task aloft was complete, and the deck could be regained whenever each man was ready to make his way down. You turned your head away from the sea and toward the mast, a slow rotation that brought the yard and the furled canvas and the dark, wet planks of the top into your immediate field of vision, while the vast grey expanse of the Southern Ocean slid out of sight behind your shoulder. The movement was small, but it marked a definite shift in the orientation of your body and your attention, a turning away from the open, empty space that had surrounded you for hours, and a turning toward the close, familiar architecture of the ship. The wind, which had been pressing steadily against your back, now caught the side of your face and tugged at the brim of your cap, a minor adjustment of pressure that you registered without thought and compensated for by dipping your chin another fraction toward your chest. The first step off the yard and back onto the top required the same careful, deliberate negotiation of limbs that the original transition had demanded, a small, precise sequence of movements that reversed the earlier pattern without exactly mirroring it. You unhooked your inner arm from the spar, feeling the sudden, cool absence of the wood against your body where the yard had been pressed for so long that it had left a deep, numb groove in the flesh of your bicep. And you straightened your back incrementally, vertebrae by vertebrae, allowing your spine to uncurl from the long, stooped posture of the work. The foot rope sagged under your shifting weight, then steadied, and you placed both hands on the yard itself, gripping the cold, rough timber while you swung your left leg up and over, your boot finding the solid planks of the top with a soft, wet thud that thrummed through the wood and into your ankle. The top received you with its familiar, steady presence, the broad platform of heavy oak feeling almost immobile after the yielding, swaying foot rope on which you had been balanced for the past hours, and you stood for a moment with both feet planted wide and both hands still resting on the yard, letting your legs adjust to the firmness of the surface beneath them. The planks were slippery with the meltwater that had run off the furled canvas and collected in shallow dark puddles in the hollows, where the wood had worn unevenly over the decades, and you placed your feet carefully, testing each step before committing your full weight. The other topmen were also making their way onto the top, their dark shapes detaching themselves from the yard one by one and stepping onto the platform with the same quiet, methodical deliberation, each man an island of calm movement in the wider stillness of the evening. You let go of the yard and stood fully upright, your spine lengthening and your shoulders squaring in a way that felt both unfamiliar and deeply relieving after the long, bent-forward posture of the work aloft. And you rolled your neck once to the left and once to the right, small gentle movements that eased the stiffness that had settled into the muscles at the base of your skull. The cold had made every joint slower to respond, so that the motions felt thick and slightly reluctant, as though your body had been packed in the same dense grey cold that filled the air. And you took your time with these small stretches, not rushing toward the descent, but letting your body dictate the pace of its own recovery. The wind was somewhat lighter here on the top, partially blocked by the bulk of the furled sail above and the mass of the mast at your back, and the relative shelter made the air feel almost mild, though you knew this was only an illusion created by the contrast with the full exposure of the yard. The transition from the top to the shrouds began with the lubber's hole, that same square opening through which you had climbed what seemed like a very long time ago, and you approached it now from above, looking down through the aperture at the dark, complicated web of rope that fell away toward the deck. The descent through the lubber's hole was always slightly more awkward than the ascent, because you had to lower yourself backward into the gap, your feet searching for the futtock shrouds while your hands held the edge of the planking, and this motion required a small, momentary act of trust in the geometry of the rigging that never quite became completely automatic. You sat on the edge of the hole, your legs dangling into the empty space, and then you turned onto your belly and slid backward, your hands gripping the cold, wet wood of the top until the last possible moment, your feet reaching down into the grey void beneath. The iron of the futtock shrouds was still slick with the thin, glassy film of ice that had formed on it hours before, but the warmth of your boots and the pressure of your grip had partially melted this film during the ascent, leaving behind a patchy, irregular surface that was more wet than frozen, and provided a better hold than you remembered. Your feet found the familiar outward-leaning angle of the iron rungs, and you transferred your weight from your hands to your legs, the muscles of your thighs and calves engaging in the slow, controlled descent that was the mirror of the climb. The futtock shrouds carried the same deep, penetrating cold that they had offered on the way up, the chill seeping through your wet boots and reaching the bones of your feet with the same patient, insistent pressure, and you moved steadily downward, not pausing until your hands closed around the familiar, fibrous surface of the hemp shrouds and your feet found the first of the ratlines. Now the descent reversed every motion of the climb with a simple, mechanical fidelity, your hands sliding down the shroud one grip at a time, while your boots descended rung by rung through the long, frozen ladder of the ratlines. The ice on the ratlines had melted in a few places where the hands and boots of the topmen had passed on the way up, leaving dark, wet patches that stood out against the surrounding whiteness. And these patches gave a slightly better purchase than the fully frozen sections, the hemp fibers springy and familiar beneath the thin leather of your boots. You took advantage of these warmer spots when you found them, letting your foot linger for a moment on the wet hemp to absorb whatever small degree of warmth remained. But you did not search them out or alter your pace to find them, simply moving downward at the same steady, unvarying rhythm that had carried you up. The descent was easier on the lungs than the climb had been, requiring less effort and generating less heat. But it was also slower in its own way, because each step downward had to be placed with care on the narrow, icy rungs, and because the natural caution of the body would not allow the same unthinking momentum that sometimes crept into an ascent. You felt each ratline before committing your weight to it, testing the ice with the toe of your boot and pressing down gently until you heard the small, satisfying crunch of the crust breaking and felt the solid hemp beneath. And only then did you shift your full weight downward and reach for the next hold. This sequence of test, press, and shift was repeated again and again, a slow, patient metronome that counted out the minutes of the descent without any need for a clock. The sounds of the deck, which had been distant and muffled during your hours aloft, now began to grow clearer and more distinct as you descended, the individual noises separating themselves from the single, blended hum of the ship and becoming recognizable as voices and footsteps, and the clank of the pump handles and the soft, rhythmic wash of the sea against the hull. You could hear the cook's mate shouting something about the state of the galley fire, the words thin and faint, but carrying the unmistakable tone of mild, everyday complaint, and you could hear the steady, wheezing sigh of the pumps as the men on deck worked the handles in their endless, patient round of keeping the bilge at bay. These sounds were the sounds of home, or as close to home as any place was on a ship rounding Cape Horn, and they drew you downward with a quiet, wordless welcome that asked for nothing and offered everything. The cold that had been so constant aloft began to ease very slightly as you descended, the air losing a degree of its biting sharpness with every 10 feet of height you surrendered to the deck, though the change was so gradual that you could not have said at what point you first noticed it. By the time you were level with the lower masthead, the temperature had risen enough that the moisture on your face no longer felt like it was freezing on contact with your skin, and the vapor of your breath, while still visible, no longer froze into a glittering mist when it left your lips. The wind, too, was losing some of its force as you dropped into the partial shelter of the hull and the boats and the deckhouses, its steady, hollow roar modulating into a more variable, gusty pattern that came and went rather than pressing continuously against your ears. Halfway down the shrouds you paused, not because you were tired or winded or uncertain of your footing, but simply because a pause felt like the natural thing to do at the midpoint of any long, slow transition from one state to another. You held the shroud with both hands, your feet planted securely on a ratline that was almost entirely free of ice, and you flexed your fingers inside your gloves, working the stiffness out of the knuckles and feeling the slow, tingling return of sensation as the blood moved more freely into the numbed extremities. The gloves themselves were in a poor state now, the leather soaked through and beginning to stiffen into strange, twisted shapes as it dried in the cold air, but they were still serviceable and would recover after a night spent near the stove in the forecastle. You looked down at the deck, which was now close enough that you could make out the individual faces of the men standing by the pinrail, and then you looked up at the top, which was now dark against the sky and already seeming distant, a place you had left rather than a place you had been. The descent resumed with the same slow, methodical rhythm, your hands sliding down the shroud, your boots finding each successive rung, the ship's side rising past you in a blur of dark planks and salt-stained paint that grew more detailed with every foot of height you lost. The caulking between the planks was visible now, the dark swollen lines of oakum tracing a pattern like the lines on a chart, and the copper sheathing below the waterline gleamed dully, where the last of the daylight caught its green-tinged surface. The sea itself was nearer now, its surface no longer a distant abstract texture, but a real, moving presence that surged and fell against the hull with each roll of the ship, and you could hear the individual slaps and gurgles of the water as it washed along the copper plates and gurgled around the rudder post far aft. The last few ratlines were the same as the first few had been, save that the ice on them was thinner and more broken from the passage of the other men who had descended before you, and your boots landed on them with a softer, wetter sound that was almost comfortable after the crisp, brittle crunch of the higher rungs. The bulwark rose beside you, its familiar, waist-high barricade of solid oak that marked the boundary between the ship and the sea, and you reached out and touched it with the palm of your hand, feeling the rough, warm grain of the wood and the faint, residual warmth that the day's small ration of light had left in its outer layer. The touch was grounding, a small tactile confirmation that you were nearly back in the world of the deck, a place where a man could stand upright without a foot rope and rest his weight on both legs without hooking an arm over a spar. Your boots touched the deck planks with a final solid thud that travelled up through your legs and into your spine, a sound and a sensation that were unmistakably the end of the descent. And you let go of the shrouds and stood for the first time in many hours on the firm, unmoving oak of the ship's waist. The deck did not move under you in the way the foot rope had moved, though of course the ship herself still rolled and pitched through the swells, but this larger motion was so familiar and so deeply embedded in your sense of balance that it did not register as movement at all, only as the natural condition of standing on a ship at sea. You took a step away from the shrouds, and your legs felt heavy and slightly strange, the muscles having been shaped for so long to the curved sway of the footrope that the flat, broad planks seemed almost too solid, too unyielding. But this sensation passed after a few paces, and you walked toward the lee of the longboat with the same steady, rolling gait you had always used on a heaving deck. The longboat was a substantial structure lashed down amidships with heavy chains and ring bolts, its overturned form creating a low, sheltered space where the wind was broken and the spray rarely reached, and you stepped into its lee with a quiet, involuntary sigh that had no particular meaning beyond the simple, physical relief of being out of the steady press of the cold air. The planks of the boat loomed above you, dark and solid, and the deck here was dry and out of the wind, the air almost still, a small pocket of relative calm in the general, ongoing motion of the ship. You leaned your shoulder against the boat's side and felt the cold of the wood through your jacket. But it was a different kind of cold than the cold aloft, a still, passive cold that did not push or pull or demand anything from your body. The ship around you was settling into its evening routine with the same quiet, unremarkable rhythm that governed all aspects of life aboard. The watch changing over with a soft shuffle of feet and a low murmur of voices as the men who had been on deck for the past 4 hours yielded their places to the men who would stand the next watch. The boatswain was coiling a length of rope on its pin with the steady, mechanical movements of long habit, his hands working independently of his eyes, and the carpenter was checking the lashings of the boats with a slow, thorough attention that missed nothing and hurried nowhere. The cook's mate had successfully resolved whatever crisis had occupied him earlier, and the galley stack was now pouring out a thicker, steadier stream of smoke that carried the faint, welcome smell of something warm cooking in a pot. All these small, ordinary activities were the fabric of the evening, the ongoing, patient work of a ship at sea, and you watched them without watching, your eyes resting lightly on the familiar shapes and movements, while your mind drifted in the quiet, receptive state that comes after long exertion in the cold. You flexed your hands inside your gloves one more time, working the last of the numbness out of your fingertips, and you felt the warmth beginning to return to your cheeks and your ears now that you were out of the direct wind. The ice on your eyelashes had melted without your noticing, leaving behind a faint, cool moisture that made your lashes feel heavier than usual when you blinked. And the salt crystals on your lips had dissolved into the general dampness of your face, so that you tasted the sea faintly every time you ran your tongue over your skin. These small residual sensations were the last traces of the hours aloft, and they would fade over the next half hour as your body warmed and dried and returned to its normal state, leaving behind nothing but the quiet, wordless memory that muscles carry, of work, this memory that muscles carry of work that has been done. The day settled back into its slow, uneventful passage toward nightfall, with the same calm, measured gravity that every day at sea eventually assumed, the light fading degree by degree into the deep, thick dusk of the high southern latitudes, and the lanterns beginning to glow on deck, small, yellow points of warmth that swayed with the ship's roll and cast long, moving shadows across the wet planks. The sea continued its endless rhythm against the hull, a sound that you would hear in your sleep and through your dreams and all the way into the morning watch, as constant and as unremarkable as your own heartbeat. The wind hummed in the rigging its low, steady note, and the ship creaked and groaned its ancient wooden language, and somewhere far to leeward the albatrosses were still riding the darkening air on their motionless, patient wings, and all of these things together formed a single, seamless whole, a quiet, unbroken fabric of existence in which there was nothing left to do and nowhere left to be except where you were.